His split lip throbbed so badly that for a second he forgot where he was. Then there was a jolt. The wooden walls shifted to the left, and he slammed his temple against something hard. A carriage. He was riding in a carriage. The hands were thin and white. Not his hands. He brought them up to his face and stared at the long fingers with scraped knuckles. A bruise glowed beneath his right eye. He ran his tongue over his lip and tasted blood. Behind the wall, someone was murmuring a prayer, quietly and monotonously. The words were foreign, but he understood the meaning. The man was asking the gods for an easy death. Not for salvation, for an easy death. Ethan Hartwell. The name came to him on its own. The youngest son of Count Hartwell, 19 years old, beaten by his older brother in front of the entire court for failing the blade trial, sent to rule the Ash Wasteland, a place where those no one cares about are sent. He closed his eyes and exhaled. Memories surged in two streams. One stream belonged to this body, the cold corridors of the ancestral castle, his father's contemptuous gaze, his older brother's fist striking his cheekbone. The second stream was his own. Seoul, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, oil rigs on the horizon, the smell of diesel fuel, tables of magnetic anomalies on his laptop screen. His name was Kim Jae-hyun. He was 32. He was a geological engineer, and he clearly remembered falling asleep at the wheel while returning from a night shift. Headlights, the shoulder of the road, a ditch, darkness. And then that carriage, and that pain, and that unfamiliar body with the shattered face. He opened his eyes again. Beyond the small windows stretched a plain. Grey, flat, not a single tree for kilometers. The land looked as if it had been burned and forgotten. But he wasn't looking at ashes. He was looking at the terrain. A slight slope toward the east, cracks in the soil running parallel to each other, a dark band on the horizon. That meant an aquifer. Perhaps a deep one. Maybe not, but it was definitely there. 7 years in the steppes had taught him to read the land like a book. The carriage jolted again. He grabbed the sidewall and began to count. Ethan's memories told him that 13 people were traveling with him. 7 could walk, 6 were wounded or sick, an old captain named Oswald, 3 veterans over 50, 2 young soldiers with bandaged arms. The rest are servants and wagon crew. Enough provisions to last 3 weeks if they rationed them. Almost no weapons. The horses were thin. The final destination was a watchtower on the edge of the wasteland. According to Oswald, it had burned down halfway 2 years ago, and no one had bothered to repair it since. Jaehyun. No, Ethan now. He should have gotten used to that name by now. Ethan looked at his hands again. Slender wrists, not a single callus. This guy had never held anything heavier than a table knife. In Mongolia, he'd lived in an iron trailer at -40. He hauled drill cores 12 hours a day. He found lithium where world-renowned geologists found nothing. And here they'd given him land. Let it be barren, let it be cursed, but land. And people. Let them be half dead, let them be written off, but people. He knew the value of both. The carriage began to slow down. Oswald's voice rang out from outside, hoarse and weary. The captain said they had arrived. Ethan sat up straight. He pushed open the door and stepped outside. The wind hit his face, dry and hot. It smelled of smoke and something else, something like ozone after a thunderstorm. A tower stood before him. The top floor was charred. The walls were cracked. The courtyard was overgrown with dry shrubs up to his waist. The gate hung by a single hinge. Oswald stood nearby. old, grey-haired, with the face of a man who had seen too much and was weary of it. He looked at Ethan, and in his eyes there was something resembling guilt. The captain said this was their new home. Ethan didn't reply. He wasn't looking at the tower. He was looking at the ground around it. Cracked soil, a grey patina. But 200 paces to the east, grass was sprouting from a crack. Not dry, green, bright. Unnaturally bright for a place where, according to legend, nothing had grown for 300 years. He shifted his gaze to the tower, then to the people climbing out of the wagon train. Their faces were grey, eyes empty. They were all waiting for death, just a slow one. Ethan turned to Oswald and said he needed a complete list of the people. Who was sick with what? Who could do what? How much water? How much food? How many tools? Everything down to the last nail. Oswald blinked. In 30 years of service, no lord had ever asked him to count nails. He asked why. Ethan looked at him calmly and replied that you can't build a house if you don't know what to build it with. Oswald opened his mouth. He closed it. Then he nodded slowly and walked toward the wagon train. Ethan was left alone in front of the tower. The wind ruffled his hair. His lip was still bleeding. He pulled a dirty handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it against the wound. Then he quietly uttered a few words in a language no one here knew. "All right, let's start with water and a map." He entered the tower. Inside it was dark and smelled musty. Stone steps led downward. It was impossible to go up. The upper floors had burned down to the skeleton. He descended the steps into the basement. The ceiling was low. The stone walls were covered with black mold. Broken barrels stood in the corner. Rags and broken dishes lay scattered on the floor, and in the farthest corner he saw it. A mirror. Black, smooth, about the size of a large book. It was leaning against the wall as if someone had placed it there yesterday. There was no dust around it. Ethan froze. The engineer inside him said it was just a piece of obsidian or something similar. But it was something else. Something new. Something Kim Jae-hyun had never had before. It told him not to touch it. Don't touch it yet. Deal with the living first. He turned around and went upstairs. Oswald was already waiting for him in the courtyard with a piece of leather and a piece of charcoal. The captain said he'd found everything as requested. 3 sacks of grain, 1.5 sacks of salt, 11 blankets, 4 of which had holes in them, 2 axes, 1 saw, not a single intact cauldron. Ethan listened and counted in his head. The grain would last 20 days if they cooked thin porridge twice a day. The salt would last a month. There wouldn't be enough blankets if the nights got colder. There were almost no tools. He asked about water. Oswald pointed to an old well by the western wall. He said there was water in it, but it was brackish. 2 people were already complaining of stomachaches. Ethan nodded. He already knew where to dig. That bright green grass to the east. He'd seen it dozens of times in Mongolia. Certain plants grew only over fresh water close to the surface. It was basic knowledge for any field geologist. But here and now, that knowledge was worth more than gold. He told Oswald that at dawn tomorrow they needed to dig in one spot. The captain asked where. Ethan pointed east, where the green grass was. 4 man-heights down there would be clear water. They'd have to dig in steps. Otherwise the wall will collapse and bury whoever is below. Oswald gave him a long look. There was doubt in that gaze. There was a question. And there was something else. A tiny spark that hadn't been there an hour ago. The captain asked how the young lord knew this. Ethan shrugged. The grass. It's that color only over fresh water. In the wasteland, almost everything is salty. But not there. Oswald was silent for 5 seconds. Then he turned to his men and began giving orders. Ethan stood in the courtyard of the ruined tower and watched the sunset over the ash wasteland. The sky was red. The earth was grey. He stood between them, in a foreign body, with a split lip, with 13 people who were waiting to die, and with 7 years of knowledge that didn't exist here. He didn't know why he was here. He didn't know how he'd ended up here. He knew only one thing. Tomorrow morning, these people would have clean water, and the day after tomorrow, he would start figuring out what else could be done. Because Kim Jae-hyun always started with water and a map. And Ethan Hartwell was going to do exactly the same. They'd been digging since dawn. Ethan marked out a square with sticks and rope, 2 by 2 paces. He showed them how to make the ledges. For every 1.5 times his height dug down, they needed to leave a step a foot wide. That would keep the wall from collapsing. Oswald assigned 3 men, 2 veterans and himself. The young soldiers, their hands bandaged, sat at the top and hauled out the soil in baskets. Ethan stood nearby and examined the soil. The top layer was dry and grey, ash mixed with clay. At a depth of 1 man's height, reddish soil began to appear, dense, moist. He crouched down and rubbed a clump between his fingers. He brought it to his nose. Iron. A lot of iron in the soil. He remembered that. It didn't matter yet, but he remembered. By noon, the pit was 2 man-height steep. The veterans were exhausted. Oswald didn't show it, but he was moving more slowly. Ethan went down into the pit himself. The captain tried to object, saying it wasn't fitting for a lord to dig. Ethan didn't reply. He took a shovel and began to work. He wasn't strong in this body. His hands trembled after every 10th stroke. His calluses burst after an hour. But he knew how to dig properly, not with strength, but with the right angle. Not with jerks, but with rhythm. Foreman Pak had taught him this at the mine in Mongolia.
An old man who could dig for 12 hours without a break because every movement he made was precise and economical. The veterans watched from above, in silence. The young lord, with a split lip, stood knee-deep in mud and dug. None of them had ever seen anything like it. By evening, the pit was 3 times his height. The soil had turned dark and heavy. Ethan stopped. He stuck the shovel in the ground and listened. Silence. Then he struck the bottom of the pit with the shovel handle. A dull thud. He struck again, slightly to the left. The sound changed. It was hollower. He smirked. They'd break through by morning. He climbed out, caked in dirt from head to toe. Oswald handed him a canteen. Ethan took a drink and sat down right on the ground. His legs were buzzing. His back was burning. His palms were scraped down to the flesh. But inside there was calm, a familiar feeling. He felt it every time the drilling went according to plan, when the earth confirmed what he had calculated. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay on the stone floor of the tower's 1st floor. The veterans were snoring nearby. Water was dripping somewhere. He thought. 13 people. 3 weeks' worth of food. A ruined tower. A wasteland that even the locals stayed away from. By the standards of his past life, this was a project with a 0 budget and bleak prospects. But he had experience launching projects like this. In Kazakhstan, he'd arrived at a site where 3 previous teams had found nothing. He had 4 people and a drilling rig with a crack in the casing. 6 months later,
They found a vein that paid for the entire eviction. The secret was simple. He didn't look where others had looked. He looked where no one had thought to look. That morning they broke through the final layer. The water didn't come right away. First, the soil at the bottom darkened, then moisture seeped out, then a thin trickle. And an hour later, the pit began to fill. Ethan climbed down and cupped his hand. He brought it to his mouth. Pure, cold, no taste of salt. He straightened up and looked up. Faces were gathered at the edge of the pit. Oswald, the veterans, the young soldiers, even the field kitchen cook had come over. Everyone was looking down at the water with an expression he'd seen only once before in his life. In Mongolia, when they found the lithium and Brigadier Pak sat down on the ground and sat there silently for 10 minutes. Oswald climbed down to him, stood beside him, took off his helmet. The old soldier with a grey moustache and a scar across his entire forehead looked at the water as if it were a miracle.
The captain said he'd been in the service for 30 years and asked how the young lord had done it.
Ethan answered simply, "Grass. It's colour and height. Plants don't lie. They grow where there's water." Oswald was silent for a long time. Then he said that at dawn he would line the men up in the courtyard. Ethan asked why. Oswald replied that the men needed to know whom they served. In the morning they lined up, all 13 of them. Even the wounded came out. They stood in a ragged line in front of the tower. Oswald walked past them. He stopped and said one sentence. He said that it seemed they were serving someone other than whom they thought. There was no grandstanding in the old captain's voice. There was no solemnity. There was only the quiet confidence of a man who had finally seen something worthwhile. Ethan stood off to the side and listened. He wasn't used to things like this. In his past life, he'd been praised for reports and charts. Here, a man stood before the formation and said he believed in them. It was different, heavier and more valuable. After the roll call, Ethan sat down on a rock by the well and began to draw. A piece of tanned leather, a piece of charcoal. He was sketching a map. Not a pretty one, a working one. A tower in the centre, a well to the east, cracks in the ground running from south to north, hills to the west. A dark streak he'd noticed yesterday to the southeast. Oswald walked over and looked over his shoulder. Ethan explained as he went along. "This line is most likely an outcrop. If we're lucky, there'll be something useful there. Carved least building stone or ore. He marked this section to the north as dangerous. The cracks are too wide. The ground could give way. Don't go there until we check it out." The captain listened in silence. He didn't understand how a 19-year-old boy knew such things. But the water in the well was real, and that outweighed any questions. By evening, Ethan had walked around the area within a 1,000-step radius of the tower. His legs ached. The blisters on his hands stung, but he'd made a list. There's water. Stone for repairs can be taken from the outcrop in the southeast. If we clear the yard of brush, there'll be room for a vegetable garden. The soil is poor, but it's not dead. He could tell by the colour, by the texture. 2 years ago, on a plot in Kazakhstan, he'd worked with similar soil. There, the locals said nothing would grow in that soil.
After one growing season, he proved them wrong. All it took was the right approach. Compost, ash, drainage, crop rotation. Things that, in his world, were basic knowledge for any agronomist. Here, they didn't exist. He returned to the tower and went down to the basement. The mirror was standing in the same spot. A smooth black surface without a single scratch. He sat down across from it and stared at it for 10 minutes, without touching it. The engineer's inner voice told him this was an anomaly and needed to be studied. Another voice, a new one,
said this wasn't just a mirror. He reached out. His fingertips touched the surface. Cold, sharp and deep, as if he dipped his hand into a mountain stream in January. And then he saw it. Not a reflection, an image, bright and fleeting like a flash, a hillside, a crack in the ground. Inside, something glowed with a warm orange light. And that was it. The mirror turned black again. Ethan pulled his hand back. His heart was pounding. He sat there for another minute. Then he stood up and left. Tomorrow he would go to the southern hills. There was something there. The mirror had shown it. And at the same time he felt a slight emptiness. A small one, almost imperceptible, as if someone had cut a tiny piece out of his memory. He tried to remember the name of the street where his house in Seoul had stood. And he couldn't. The street was there. He remembered the house. He remembered the color of the door, but the name had vanished. He froze on the steps. Then he exhaled slowly and went upstairs. He needed to get some sleep. Tomorrow would be a long day. On the fourth day, Ethan headed for the southern hills. He took Oswald and 2 veterans with him. One was named Bran, a stocky, taciturn old man with a broken nose. The other was named Tom, thin and sinewy with a constant cough that he muffled with a rag. Both had served for more than 20 years. Both had ended up in the Wasteland because they were too old for the regular army and too proud to accept charity. They walked in silence. Ethan kept his eyes on the ground, a habit he'd developed back in Mongolia. The earth speaks louder than the sky. The color of the soil changed. Grey gave way to reddish-brown, then to brown. The cracks grew deeper. He stopped every 100 steps and made marks on the map, with a piece of charcoal on his skin. Quick strokes, letters that no one but him could read. The Korean alphabet. It was convenient. No one in Asteria could read his notes.
An hour later, they reached the hills, not very high, about 30 meters.
The slopes were covered with gravel and dry earth. Ethan walked all the way around the first hill. He stopped on the south side. Here the rock was exposed, dark, dense, with a distinctive sheen. He crouched down and chipped off a piece with a stone. He held it up to his eyes, turned it over, licked it. Oswald watched him with the expression of someone who had long since ceased to be surprised. Ethan said it was good rock for building, dense and smooth. It could be cut into blocks, but that wasn't the point. He walked further along the slope, looking for a crack, the very one from the vision. He found it 20 minutes later. A narrow fissure in the rock, 2 fists wide, sloping downward at an angle. He lay down on the ground and peered inside. It was dark, but warm air was rising from below. A gentle current, steady. That meant there was a cavity down there, a large cavity. Warm air was rising from the underground space. In geology, this was called a thermal anomaly. Here it wasn't called anything, because no one here knew that the earth could be warm from within. Ethan stood up and dusted off his knees. He needed to widen the crevice, carefully. If what he suspected was down there, it changed everything. They returned to the tower by evening. Ethan gathered everyone in the courtyard, all 13 of them. He stood before them with a map in his hands and spoke. He spoke simply, no long speeches, no grandstanding. He outlined the situation. They had 20 days' worth of food. They had water. They had stone for repairs. But they needed more. They needed walls. They needed a roof over their heads before the cold set in. They needed a vegetable garden. They needed to hunt if there was game in the area. They needed to divide up the work. He assigned the tasks. Bran and Tom would handle the stone, hauling it from the hills to the tower. 2 young soldiers would clear the courtyard for a vegetable garden. The cook, whose name was Mary, would take charge of the kitchen and supplies. Ethan would personally draw up a list for her detailing what and how much to use each day. Oswald was in charge of security and reconnaissance, a daily patrol of the perimeter, a report every evening. One of the veterans, named Haggard, limped on his left leg, but his hands were skilled. Ethan put into work repairing the gate and the first-floor roof. Then he said something that silenced everyone.
He said that from that day on, everyone would eat from a single pot. One meal for all, one serving for all, including him. The lords usually ate separately. Better. More. It was so normal that no one even thought it could be any other way. Oswald looked at him. Ethan held his gaze. The captain nodded. On the 5th day, Ethan returned to the crevice in the hills, this time with Bran and 2 shovels. They worked to widen the crevice for 4 hours. The rock was hard, the shovels dulled. Bran worked silently and doggedly, like a man who knows how to do only one thing, to do what he was told, and to do it well. By noon, the crevice was wide enough to crawl through. Ethan tied a rope around himself. Bran held the other end, and he crawled down. A narrow passage, rocks dug into his shoulders, darkness, the smell of earth and something else, something metallic. 10 minutes later, the passage widened. He found himself in a cavity, small, about the size of a room. The ceiling was low. He had to crouch. He took out the flint he'd borrowed from Oswald and struck a spark. In the light of the small flame, he saw the walls. They glistened. Not stone, not ore, something else. Veins in the rock, thin, silvery with a slight blue sheen. He stepped closer and touched them. Warm. The rock was warm to the touch. And at that moment, he sensed it. He didn't hear it, he didn't see it, he felt it. A rumble, low and deep, coming from beneath the earth, from its very core, as if something enormous were breathing far below, slowly and heavily. The hairs on his arms stood on end. The engineer inside him said it might be geothermal activity, volcanic rock, residual heat. But the other part, the part that had come into this world, the part that had touched the black mirror, knew it wasn't a volcano. He picked up a piece of veined rock and climbed back up. Up above, Bran was waiting with a rope. Ethan made it out. He sat down on the ground. He looked at the piece of rock in his hand. The veins shimmered in the sun, barely noticeable. He asked Bran if he'd ever seen a rock like this. The old veteran looked at it. He frowned. Then he said one word. Spark. Ethan didn't understand. Bran explained, briefly, in a soldier's way. It was spark ore, magical ore. Weapons and armor for the High Knights were made from it. It was worth more than gold, much more. A chunk the size of a fist could buy a herd of horses, and only the great houses possessed it. Each had its own deposit, guarded like a treasure trove. Ethan looked at the chunk in his hand, then at the crevice he'd just crawled out of, then back at the stone. In his past life, he'd found lithium and rare earth metals. That brought in money and career advancement. But here, in this world, he'd just found something greater. He'd found the reason they wouldn't leave him alone, and at the same time a reason why he might survive. Bran was looking at him. There was fear in the old veteran's eyes, not for himself, but for the situation. He understood what this meant. Ethan told Bran not to tell anyone, not yet. First, they needed to figure out how much ore was here. Bran nodded, in silence. They returned to the tower before dark. That night, Ethan lay awake, thinking. Spark ore.
magical ore beneath his feet. It was both a salvation and a death sentence. If the great houses found out, it wouldn't be inspectors who came here. Armies would come here. He needed time. Time to fortify himself. Time to gather people. Time to become strong enough to hold on to what he had found. He rolled onto his side. He looked at the wall. And he began to count. How much stone was needed for the outer wall? How many people for a permanent guard? How much food for half a year? How many tools for the forge? The numbers came one after another, familiar and soothing, just like in the old days when he'd sit in the trailer at night and tally up supplies before the drilling season. Toward morning, he fell asleep. He dreamed of Mongolia, the steppe stretching to the horizon, the metal trailer, Foreman Park sitting on a chair by the entrance drinking instant coffee. He looked at him and said, "Jae-hyun, when you're digging, don't think about what you'll find. Think about those waiting up above." He woke up to a sound. Oswald was standing over him. The captain said there was dust on the horizon. Someone was coming, from the north. Ethan stood up. He stretched his neck. He went out into the yard. The sun hadn't risen yet. It was a grey dawn. And there really was dust rising in the north, a small cloud. One wagon, maybe two. Ethan squinted. Then he turned to Oswald and told him to get the men ready. Not for battle, for a meeting. If they'd wanted to attack, they wouldn't be travelling on the road in broad daylight. Oswald grunted, for the first time ever. He almost smiled. There was only one wagon, an old one, with a patched-up canopy. It was pulled by a gaunt horse that looked as if it had long since decided to die but had forgotten how. The driver sat on the box.
A young guy with frightened eyes. Two people were walking behind the wagon, a girl of about 17, petite, fair-haired, wearing an oversized travel cloak, and a man in his 40s with a tool cart that he was pushing in front of him. When the wagon stopped at the gate, Oswald placed his hand on his sword. Ethan stood beside him. The girl stepped forward. She was dirty from the road. Her hair was matted. There were stains on her hands, not dirt, chemical burns. Ethan recognized them immediately. The lab assistants at the mining site had the same ones when they worked with reagents without gloves. The girl introduced herself. Leah Moon, daughter of the Hartwell House court alchemist. She had been sent here along with Ethan, but her carriage had fallen 2 days behind due to a broken wheel. The coachman confirmed this. He added that they had nearly gotten lost because the road to the tower had almost disappeared. Ethan looked at Leah. She was looking at him. Her eyes held a mixture of fear and stubbornness. She waited, waiting to be sent away, or ignored, or told to sit quietly and not get in the way. Ethan asked what she could do. Leah blinked. No one had ever asked her that question before. She began to speak, disjointedly, quickly. The words poured out in a stream. She knew the basics of alchemy. She could work with acids and alkalis. She knew how to purify salts. She knew 14 recipes for medicinal ointments. She could determine the composition of a rock by the color of the flame when you threw a sample into the fire. Ethan listened. Every word. She knew spectral analysis. Primitive, of course, without instruments, but the principle was the same. Throw it into the fire and look at the color. Green means copper. Red means lithium or strontium. Blue means lead. He almost laughed. In another world, at another time, she would have been a chemist, a good chemist, maybe even an excellent one. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her cloak. Ethan spoke briefly. He needed someone who knew how to work with chemicals. He asked if she had any tools. Leah nodded and reached into the wagon. She pulled out a chest. It was heavy,
She opened it. Inside were test tubes, a mortar, a scale, tubes, a burner, cloth filters, a set of reagents in sealed vials. Ethan looked at it all and thought that the alchemists here were closer to chemists than he'd assumed. Not magicians, practitioners.
Leah worked with substances using her hands, not spells. That was exactly what he needed. The man with the cart wasn't with Leah. He was walking on his own, a wandering carpenter named Griffin. He was heading south in search of work. He'd heard from travelers that someone was settling in the Wasteland. He decided to give it a try. Ethan examined his tools. Planes, chisels, a saw. Everything was old but well maintained. A man who takes care of his tools usually knows his craft. He offered Griffin a place to stay, food, shelter, enough work to last for years. The carpenter looked at the tower, at the charred walls, at the people in the courtyard, then at Ethan. He nodded. By evening, Leah had already set up her lab in a corner of the first floor. Ethan brought her a piece of rock from the cave. He didn't say where it came from. He just asked her to identify it. Leah took the rock. She turned it over in her hands, scraped it with her fingernail, sniffed it. Then she chipped off a small piece and tossed it into the burner's flame. The flame flared white, a pure, bright white. Leah recoiled. Her hands trembled. She looked up at Ethan and whispered, "It's spark ore. High purity, very high." She said that her father had worked with samples of spark ore that were supplied to the House of Hartwell from the ancestral deposit. Those samples burned yellow-white. This one burns pure white. That means the magical substance content is higher, significantly higher. Ethan told her to be quiet. She didn't understand. He explained, "If even a single rumor about this gets out beyond the tower, people with swords will come here, and there will be many of them." Leah turned pale, but she nodded. Then she asked where he'd gotten the stone. Ethan replied that it was from the local hills. Leah looked at him intently. Then she said quietly that he didn't look like the lord they'd described at court. There, they'd said that Ethan Hartwell was a weak and talentless boy whom everyone pitied. Ethan shrugged and replied that people change. That night, he went down to the basement again, to the mirror. He sat down across from it. He stared at the black surface for a long time. Then he touched it. The cold stung his fingers. The image came faster than the first time. 2 images. The first, a road from the north, a cage on wheels, people in the cage chained, a convoy of 4 soldiers in uniforms he didn't recognize. The second image, the same road, empty, no one. 2 forks in the road. 2 possible futures. The mirror showed the images and went dark. Ethan withdrew his hand and immediately felt it. A loss. Small, precise, as if someone had cut out yet another little piece. He tried to recall the taste of kimchi jjigae, the soup he'd eaten every week for 7 years straight. He remembered that he loved it. He remembered what the bowl looked like. He remembered the steam. But the taste was gone. It was simply not there. An empty space where there used to be something warm and spicy and familiar. He sat in the basement and breathed steadily, counting his inhalations and exhalations. The mirror was taking its toll, every time. Memories from a past life. Those little things that made him Kim Jae-hyun. He had to decide. That cage on the road, those people in chains. He could step forward to meet them, or he could stay back. If he stepped forward, he'd be meddling in someone else's business. He'd draw attention. He'd put his people at risk. If he didn't step out, the road would remain empty and safe. The mirror didn't explain what was right. It showed what was possible. The choice was his to make. He stepped out of the basement. The common room was quiet. Everyone was asleep. Only Oswald was sitting by the entrance, keeping watch. Ethan walked over and sat down beside him. The captain looked at him. Ethan said that in 2 or 3 days, people would arrive from the north, bringing prisoners. Oswald asked how he knew. Ethan replied that he had his ways, and that he needed advice, whether to intervene or not. Oswald was silent for a long time. Then he asked who these prisoners were. Ethan said he didn't know. He'd only seen a cage and chains. Oswald rubbed his chin. He said that if they were convicts, intervening would be a rebellion against the sentence. If they were slaves, intervening would be theft of another's property. Either way, it would give any house a reason to send a punitive expedition. Ethan nodded. He knew that. But a cage, chains, people. He looked at Oswald and said that tomorrow they would go out to the road, just to take a look, unarmed. They'd take a look and decide on the spot. Oswald sighed, a heavy, familiar sigh. The sighs of a man who understands that his commander has just made a decision that cannot be reversed. The captain nodded and said he would wake Bran and Tom at dawn. They set out before dawn. Ethan, Oswald, Bran, Toma. 4 of them on an empty road in the middle of a grey plain. They had few weapons. Oswald had a sword. Bran had an axe.
Toma carried a spear with a cracked shaft. Ethan walked unarmed. He didn't know how to fight. Ethan Hartwell's body had never held a blade for more than 10 minutes in Icanical. That was a truth he had accepted on the very first day. His value lay not in swords. They had walked about 5,000 paces north when Oswald raised his hand. They stopped. The captain pointed ahead. Dust, and a sound, the creak of wheels, a horse's neigh, voices. They stepped off the road and lay down behind a low stone ridge. Ethan peered over the edge. The wagon was moving slowly. Not an ordinary wagon. A cage on wheels. Iron bars. 3 people inside. 2 men and a teenager. The men were in tattered clothing. Military clothing. Ethan could make out the remnants of chainmail on one of them. The second was larger, broad-shouldered, with closely cropped hair. The teenager, about 15 years old, sat in the corner of the cage, hugging his knees. The escort consisted of 4 men, all on horseback. Uniforms. Ethan looked closer. His body's memories told him. Green and silver. House Velcourt, one of the 12 great houses. Oswald whispered the same thing from beside him. Velcourt. And he added that there was a sign hanging on the cage. Ethan squinted. He made out the letters. Convicted, for breach of oath. Being taken to the place of execution. Execution at dawn upon arrival. He lay behind the rocks and thought. 4 guards, all on horseback, with swords. His group, 4 men on foot, armed with an axe and a broken spear. The odds were dismal. Oswald seemed to read his thoughts. The captain whispered that 4 horsemen were a serious threat, even if the guards weren't elite. A horseman against a foot soldier meant an advantage in height, speed, and striking power. A head-on attack was out of the question. Ethan nodded. He hadn't planned on attacking head-on anyway. He looked at the road and thought like an engineer, not a warrior. The road ran through a narrow passage between 2 rocky ridges. A narrowing, a natural funnel. In a place like this, horsemen lose their greatest asset, room to maneuver. If 2 of them take up positions on either side, high up on the rocks, if one blocks the exit, if they do it quickly and noisily, not to attack but to scare the horses. He turned to Oswald and began to explain, quickly, quietly. The captain listened. His expression didn't change. When Ethan finished, Oswald stared at him for a few seconds. Then he said it might work, or they'd all die.
Ethan replied that he knew. They took their positions, Bran and Toma on the rocks to the right and left of the passage. Ethan gave each of them 3 large rocks, heavy ones, with sharp edges, not for people, for horses. The sound of falling rocks and the dust would scare the horses better than screams. Oswald stood at the end of the passageway, alone, with a sword. His task was simple: to stand there and look as if there were 20 more men behind him. Oswald was good at it. 30 years of service had taught him to stand in a way that even a wall would envy. Ethan hid behind a boulder at the entrance to the passageway, unarmed, with a rope. His task was the simplest and the craziest: to wait for the panic to start and cut the wagon's harness so the horse wouldn't drag the cage away. The convoy entered the passageway. The first rider, the second, the wagon with the cage. The third and fourth brought up the rear. Ethan waited. His heart was pounding in his throat. His hands were shaking. He wasn't a soldier. He was a geological engineer from Seoul who had never been in a fight more serious than a school brawl. But he was also a man who, for 7 years, had made decisions on which the lives of his team depended. And he knew one thing for certain: panic kills faster than swords. Bran threw the first stone. A heavy cobblestone crashed against the rock 1/2 meter from the first rider's head. Dust shot up in a column. The horse reared up. The second stone fell in front of the second horse. Toma, from the other side, struck the rock with his spear. The sound of metal against stone, sharp and deafening in the narrow passage. The echo turned a single blow into 10. The horses in the convoy went wild. The first one lunged forward and saw Oswald. The old captain stood in the passageway with his legs spread wide. His sword hung in his lowered hand. His face was stony. The horse snorted and backed away. The rider tried to hold her back. He tugged at the reins. He shouted. The second horse spun around and collided with the third. The riders in the rear couldn't move forward and couldn't turn around. The passage was too narrow. Ethan rushed toward the wagon. A knife, a small utility knife he'd borrowed from Mary. He cut the harness ropes. His hands were shaking. The knife kept slipping. The first rope gave way. The second. The third. The wagon's horse bolted forward. The cage remained in place. One of the guards spotted him. He turned his horse around. He drew his sword. Ethan fell to the ground, not from clumsiness, but from fear. The sword swept over his head. He felt the wind from the blade, cold and swift. Bran leaped off the rock, heavily and clumsily, but precisely. He crashed into the horse's hindquarters and the rider flew to the ground. The old man fell on top of him. He pinned him down. Toma hurled the broken spear like a javelin. It struck the third escort's horse in the side. Not deeply, but enough to make it go wild and carry the rider away from the passage. Oswald, up ahead, met the first escort, short and hard. The old captain didn't move quickly, but every movement was as precise as a blueprint. He parried the blow from above, stepped to the side, struck at the arm. The escort dropped his sword and clutched his forearm. The fourth rider watched it all unfold. The stones flying down from above, Oswald in front of him, Bran, who was his comrade, at the empty carriage with its harness severed. And he made the only sensible decision. He turned his horse around and galloped away. The third man, whose horse had already carried him off, was far away. 2 remained. One was pinned down by Bran. The other knelt, swordless, before Oswald. Ethan rose from the ground. His knees were shaking. His hands were shaking. There was blood on his shirt. Not his own. It was the horses and the wagons. He walked over to the cage. The 3 inside were looking at him, silently. A woman. Now he could see. He'd mistaken one of the men for a man because of his short-cropped hair and chainmail. But it was a woman. Tall, dark-haired, with a long scar running from her temple to her jaw. She looked at him expressionlessly.
like someone who had seen it all and had stopped being surprised. The second man was indeed a man, burly, fair-haired, with a broken nose. The teenager was still sitting in the corner, hugging his knees. Ethan felt for the lock. He found it. Heavy, made of iron. The key was with the guard whom Bran was holding at gunpoint. Oswald took the key. He opened the cage. The woman stepped out first. She stood in front of Ethan, a head taller than him. She looked down at him. Then she asked who he was. Ethan replied that his name was Ethan Hartwell and that this was his land. The woman introduced herself. Serafina Velcour, a former knight of House Velcour, sentenced to death for refusing to kill an unarmed prisoner on orders. The man followed the house. He introduced himself as Gareth.
Serafina's squire. He refused to leave her and was sentenced along with her. The teenager was last. His name was Finn. He was a page. He was 14. His crime was that he had brought Serafina water after her arrest. For that, he was labelled an accomplice. Ethan listened, silently. Then he turned to Oswald. The captain understood without words. 2 guards had escaped. They would make it to the nearest garrison and report that someone in the Wasteland had attacked the Valcourt House convoy. That would be a problem. A big problem. Ethan looked at Serafina. The tall woman with the scar stood upright despite the chains on her wrists. Just like a soldier. Just like someone who doesn't bend even when they're supposed to. He asked her if she knew how to teach others. Serafina didn't understand. Ethan explained. He didn't just need a blade. He needed someone who can turn the elderly and the wounded into people capable of defending the wall. He needed a teacher. Serafina looked at him for a long time. Then she said yes. She could. Ethan nodded and turned to Oswald. He asked him to remove their chains. Oswald took out a key. The chains fell to the ground. Serafina rubbed her wrists. She looked at her hands, then at Ethan. And she said quietly that she didn't know who he was or why he'd done this, but that she would remember. Ethan didn't answer. He was already walking back to the wagon. The wheels and axles had to be removed. Iron. Any iron in the Wasteland was more valuable than silver. On the way back, Serafina walked beside Oswald. They didn't speak, but Ethan saw the captain glance at her, an assessing look, a professional one, and he gave a slight nod. A soldier recognized a soldier. By the time they returned to the tower, the sun was already setting. Leah ran out to meet them. She saw the strangers. She saw the blood on Ethan's shirt. She turned pale. He told her the blood wasn't his and that they had new people. That evening he sat by the well and updated the map. Nearby, Griffin was planing boards for a new door. Bran was sharpening an axe. Toma was coughing into a rag. Serafina stood by the gate, gazing at the horizon. Finn was sleeping on a blanket in the corner of the courtyard. For the first time in days, he was probably sleeping peacefully. Gareth sat next to him. A tall, fair-haired man with a broken nose sat beside the teenager, making sure he didn't get cold. Ethan was counting. 16 people now. 9 of them were combat-ready, sort of. If you counted Serafina, Gareth and Bran, 1 alchemist, 1 carpenter, 1 cook, 3 wounded, 1 teenager, 16 people at the edge of the world, with a well, with deposits of ore that must not be spoken of, with a mirror that shows the future but steals memories, and now with 2 escaped convicts who would tell everyone that someone in the Wasteland was attacking people from the great houses. He shifted his gaze to the tower, charred, crooked, with a leaky roof that Haggard had been patching from morning till night. This was his home. He had taken these people under his protection, and now he had to make sure that when they came looking for answers, He could give an answer that wouldn't end in graves. He looked at his hands, scraped calluses, dirt under his fingernails, a scratch from a knife when he was cutting the harness. Not the hands of a lord, the hands of a laborer. He clenched his fists, unclenched them, and began sketching out a plan for the wall. Height, thickness, location. Stone from the southern hills. Griffin would build the scaffolding. Bran and Toma would carry the stone. Everyone else would help. The wall would be built. Before anyone arrives here with questions, the wall will be standing. They began building the wall the next morning. Ethan marked out the perimeter with sticks and ropes. Not all the way around the tower. There wouldn't be enough people or stone for that. Just the north side. That's where they'll come from, if they come at all. The south and east sides are shielded by hills. The west side abuts a rocky ridge. The north is open. A flat plain stretching for kilometers. Anyone from a line would be visible from far away. But seeing isn't enough. You need something to stand behind. He designed a wall 3 times a man's height, 2 paces thick at the base and 1.5 at the top, tapered toward the top for stability. It was basic engineering. A trapezoidal cross-section. Pyramids have stood for thousands of years based on the same principle. They hauled stone from the southern hills. Bran and Toma would set out every morning with a cart and bring back 24 blocks by lunchtime. Griffin made wooden sleds from a dismantled wagon. With them, the work goed faster. Serafina worked alongside everyone else, silently, without complaint. She hauled stones that not every man could lift. Gareth worked for 2. Strong and young, he was stronger than any of the veterans. Finn carried water. Mary cooked for everyone.
Leah was torn between the lab and the construction site. Ethan forbade her from carrying heavy loads. He needed her hands intact for working with reagents. Instead, he assigned her another task. Mortar. The stones needed to be bound together. Ordinary clay wouldn't do. It cracked as it dried and was washed away by the rain. Ethan explained the principle to her. Calcined limestone mixed with sand and water. Cement. The simplest Roman cement, which is 2,000 years old. They didn't know about it here. Here, stones were laid on clay or simply stacked on top of one another. Leah listened with eyes aglow. She asked questions, lots of questions. The right questions. What was the firing temperature? What was the ratio of sand to lime? How much water? Ethan answered from memory. Not everything was exact. He was a geologist, not a builder, but he knew the principle. And Leah was a hands-on person. She could bring to fruition what he had described in general terms. 3 days later, she brought him a sample, a gray lump caked onto a stone. Ethan tried to pry it off. It wouldn't budge. He tried harder. The rock cracked. The solution remained intact. Leah stood nearby, waiting. Her fingers were smeared with lime. A white streak ran down her cheek. Ethan told her she'd done a great job. Leah blushed all the way to the roots of her hair and ran off to the lab. Oswald saw this and chuckled. Meanwhile, Serafina began her training. Ethan asked her to do this on the 2nd day after their release. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked who she was supposed to train. He pointed to the courtyard. Everyone. Everyone who could hold a stick. Serafina surveyed the people. 2 young soldiers with healed wounds. Brana and Tom. Gareth. Finn. Even Haggard with his injured leg. She started with the basics. Stance, grip, step, strike, block. No swords. Sticks. Long, straight sticks made from the trunks of dry shrubs. Serafina taught strictly but without cruelty. She didn't yell. She didn't humiliate them. She simply demonstrated, over and over, the correct movement. And she watched, patiently, until they got it right. Finn was afraid of her.
Gareth had gotten used to it. The young soldiers tried their best. Bran and Tama gritted their teeth but did as they were told. Haggard, with his injured leg, couldn't move like the others. Serafina walked over to him. She stood there for a moment. Then she showed him a different set of movements. For someone who can't take a step.
For someone who has to stand in place and hold the position. Haggard looked at her. There was something strange in his eyes. Gratitude. No one had ever adapted to him before. He was either forced to do the same thing as everyone else or sent to sit on the sidelines. Ethan watched this from the roof of the tower, where he was laying stones to repair the top floor. He saw how Serafina worked with people, and he saw in her what he had come to recognize. She was doing the same thing he was, adapting the system to the person, rather than the person to the system. On the 9th day, after the captives were freed, Ethan went down to the basement to the mirror. He didn't want to. Every time he used it, it cost him a piece of his past, but he needed to know. Those 2 guards, where had they gone? What would happen? He touched the black surface. Cold. Images. 3 of them this time. The first, a horseman in a green and silver Velcourt uniform rides into a large city. Gates bearing a coat of arms. Towers. He's delivering a report. The second, the same city a few days later. A group of horsemen rides south. 10, maybe 12, with swords and spears. Third, the same group of horsemen, but they turn back. Before reaching their destination, something stops them. That's it. The mirror went dark. The payment came immediately. He tried to remember Foreman Pack's face, the man who taught him how to dig properly, the man who drank instant coffee at the entrance to the trailer every morning. The voice remained, the words remained, but the face, a blurry smudge, like a photograph thrown into water. Ethan clenched his teeth. He sat there for a minute. Then he stood up and went upstairs. 3 images. The convoy had reached the city. A detachment was coming. 10 or 12 men, but the third image showed that they would turn back. Something would stop them. What? The mirror didn't explain. He had to figure it out himself. Ethan sat down by the well and thought. What could stop the detachment? An order from above? Another threat? Or information that would make the trip pointless? He chose the third option. He had to make the attack on the convoy look different from what it actually was. Not a mutiny, not a robbery. Something else. He called for Oswald. He explained the plan. The 2 convoy prisoners that Bran and Oswald were holding in the basement had to be released, but not just released. They needed to be given a story, a version of events they would tell their commanders. Oswald listened. He frowned. Ethan continued. The guards would say that their unit had been caught in a magical storm. The Wasteland. That's normal here. Storms rip roofs off buildings in the border towns. Caravans disappear entirely. No one will be surprised. A storm wrecked the wagon. The horses bolted. The captives escaped in the chaos. The guards survived by a miracle. They found their way to the tower. Lord Hartwell sheltered them for the night and sent them home. It was a lie. But it was a lie that worked because it suited everyone. For the guards, who didn't want to admit that they'd been overpowered by 4 old men with an axe and a broken spear. For House Velcourt, for whom it was easier to chalk up the loss to the Wasteland than to send a punitive expedition into the scorched wilderness. For the king, who didn't need yet another conflict. Oswald listened. He was silent for a long time. Then he said it might work. But he added that the guards would have to believe it. Ethan replied that they would believe it because they wanted to believe it. No one wants to tell their superiors that they were disarmed by old men. In the morning, the guards were led out. They were fed. Their scrapes were bandaged. Ethan spoke with each one separately.
calmly, without frets. He explained that a storm had struck, that he'd found them on the road, that he hadn't seen any prisoners. He gave each of them a canteen of water and pointed them in the direction of the nearest garrison. The guards left, quickly, without looking back. Oswald stood nearby and watched them go. Then he said that Ethan was either the smartest person he'd ever met or the craziest. Ethan replied that, in his experience, those two were usually one and the same. A week passed. The wall grew, slowly, stone by stone. Leah's mortar held firmly. Griffin built scaffolding so the workers could lay the upper rows. Serafina continued her training every morning. Finn began to show his first signs of progress. The boy was fast, agile. He lacked strength, but his movements were precise. Serafina nodded at him once after a sparring session, briefly, almost imperceptibly. Finn beamed all day. Ethan cleared the vegetable garden. He cleared the plot south of the tower. He removed the top layer of dead soil. Beneath it was clay, heavy and dense. He mixed it with ash from the hearth and compost made from kitchen scraps. He showed Mary how to stack the scraps in the compost pit. The cook looked at him in horror.
A lord rummaging through scraps. But she did it anyway. He found the first seeds in the supply wagon. A handful of barley, a little turnip, a few bulbs, a pittance, but a start. He planted everything systematically. Rows, spacing, depth. He'd explain crop rotation later when there was something to rotate with. For now, he just needed to grow at least something on land where nothing had grown for 300 years. On the evening of the 13th day, Ethan sat on the flough and watched the sunset. Orange light fell on the grey earth and turned it copper. Beautiful. He hadn't expected that. Down in the courtyard, Serafina was cleaning her training sticks, methodically, carefully. Gareth was helping Griffin with the door to the lower level. Leah sat in her corner, grinding something in a mortar. Bran and Toma were playing dice by the well. Finn was sleeping on a blanket under the shelter that Haggard had built that morning. Oswald was patrolling the perimeter. Mary was clanging the octa. 16 people. Everyone was busy. Everyone knew their task. Everyone was eating from the same pot. Ethan allowed himself a breath, loaded and slow. In a past life, he would have called this the launch of a project. Phase 1, stabilization. Water, food, safety, people. The phase was almost complete. It would get harder from here on out, but it would go on. Toward the end of the 3rd week, Yasmina arrived. No one saw her come. Oswald swore he'd patrolled the perimeter twice that morning. Bran was standing on the wall looking north, but she came from the south, from the Wasteland, from a place where, according to the locals, nothing alive ever comes. Ethan was sitting by the well, updating the map, when a shadow fell across his hands. He looked up. A woman was standing before him, dark-skinned, thin, wearing faded clothes made of coarse leather. On her back was something like a stretcher made of sticks and cloth. A man lay on the stretcher. A young man, unconscious. His left leg was bandaged with rags blackened by dried blood. The woman looked at Ethan. Her eyes were dark, calm. No fear, no plea. She said her name was Yasmina Aldari, that she was from the southern steppes, that this was her brother, that his tribe had left him to die because he couldn't walk, that she had carried him for 6 days. She spoke with a strong accent, concise, each word like a stone set in its place. Ethan stood up. He called for Mary. Hot water, clean rags, whatever they had. Yasmina looked at him. Then at the tower, at the wall that was already half built, at the people working in the courtyard, and she said quietly that he had the eyes of a man who had died and come back to life, that she'd seen something like that before. Ethan froze. For a second. Then he said he needed someone who knew about herbs and healing, and that her brother would live. Yasmina didn't answer. She knelt down next to the stretcher and began unwrapping the bandage on her brother's leg. The wound was bad. A deep, jagged gash from knee to ankle. The edges were inflamed. Pus. The smell. Ethan had seen this before. In Kazakhstan, one of the workers had sliced his leg open on the edge of a sheet of metal. No antibiotics. No hospital closer than 100 kilometers away. Foreman Pak had washed the wound with boiled water and salt and stitched it up with coarse thread. The guy survived. Ethan told Yasmina that she needed to wash the wound with boiled water. She looked at him in surprise. Boiled, not cold. He explained, unboiled water contains things you can't see with the naked eye. Tiny creatures. They get into the wound and cause decay and fever. Boiling kills them. Yasmina listened. She didn't argue. She didn't ask for clarification. She just listened and took it all in. Then she nodded and got to work. She knew her herbs. Ethan knew nothing about local plants, but Yasmina knew everything. Which root reduces fever? Which leaf draws out pus? Which powder stops the bleeding? She combined her knowledge with his principle. Clean water, clean hands, clean cloth for bandages. In 3 days, her brother's fever had subsided. A week later, he opened his eyes. His name was Kadir. He was 20. He was a hunter. He'd been wounded by the claws of some beast on the steppe. The tribe decided he would die and that dragging him along would put the rest of them at risk. Yasmina disagreed. She set out alone, carrying her brother on her back. 6 days across the wasteland. Ethan listened to this story and thought about how strength takes many forms. Serafina was strong with a blade, Oswald with experience, Leah with her mind. Yasmina was strong because she didn't give up. He told her she could stay if she wanted to. Yasmina replied that she would stay until her brother was back on his feet. She stayed forever, but she didn't know that yet. The month was drawing to a close. Ethan tallied the results. 2/3 of the wall was built. The north side was complete. It was 2.5 his height. Not 3, as he'd planned, but it was a start. The well was working reliably. The vegetable garden had produced its first sprouts. Barley had broken through the tilled soil. Turnips, too. Onions were the first to sprout. Every morning, Mary would go out to look at the sprouts and mutter that it was witchcraft. Ethan told her it was compost and ash. Mary didn't believe him. Leah made the first batch of soap. Ethan explained the principle to her. Fat and lye. Ash dissolved in water produces lye. Fat from the hunt. Mix them together, heat it, let it set. The soap turned out rough and smelled bad, but it lathered. Ethan gathered everyone and said that from that day on, everyone had to wash their hands before eating. Everyone, no exceptions. Oswald asked why. Ethan replied that those very tiny creatures that cause wounds to fester also live on people's hands, and they get into the food, and they cause stomach illnesses that make people weak and kill them. He said this with a completely serious expression. He added that he knew aristocrats didn't wash, but they aren't aristocrats here. They're just trying to survive, and he'd rather his men die at the hands of their enemies than from diarrhea. Toma laughed, for the first time ever. A hoarse, barking laugh that made him cough immediately, but he laughed. Oswald didn't laugh. He looked at Ethan. Then he said he'd follow orders. And he washed his hands first, every single time, ostentatiously, in front of everyone. The old captain might not have understood why, but if his lord said to wash his hands, then he had to wash his hands. On the 30th day, Ethan went to the crevice in the southern hills. Leah and Bran were with him. He wanted to show Leah the vein. She was supposed to assess the ore reserves, at least roughly. They climbed down together. Ethan went first.
Leah followed him. Bran stayed above with the rope. Inside the underground cavity, Leah froze. She stood before a wall with silvery veins and didn't move. Ethan could see her hands trembling. She ran her finger along one vein, then another. She counted. She estimated the thickness, the length, the depth of the deposit. She said there was more ore here than in the Hartwell family's ancestral mine, significantly more, and the purity was higher. Ethan asked how much more. Leah paused. Then she said that, based on a rough estimate, the reserves would last for decades of continuous mining. Maybe 100. Ethan nodded. He'd expected something like that.
The structure of the veins indicated a deep and extensive source. This isn't a shallow deposit. It's the tip of something enormous.
They went back upstairs. Ethan told Leah that she needed to learn how to process the ore, to purify it, to concentrate it, to turn it into something useful. Leah replied that she'd need a furnace for that, a special one with a high temperature, and crucibles, and tools she didn't have. Ethan looked at her and asked what if he built her a furnace. Leah paused. She looked at him. Then she said quietly that if she had a furnace, she could do it. Her voice trembled, not from fear, from something else. All her life she'd heard that she was mediocre, that her father was better, that a girl didn't belong in a lab, that she was just wasting reagents. And here stood a man offering to build her a furnace, for her, so she could work. They returned to the tower. Ethan sat down with Griffin and began to sketch. A furnace, the simplest smelting furnace. The principle, he knew the principle. A shaft-type design, double walls with an air gap for insulation, air blown in from below through channels. It wasn't a blast furnace, it was closer to what early metallurgists used, but it was sufficient for processing small amounts of ore. Griffin listened. He scratched the back of his head. He said he'd never built anything like this, but he understood the principle and could give it a try. On the 32nd day, something else happened. Ethan was walking around the tower's basement. He was checking the walls for cracks. In the far corner, behind a mirror, he noticed an irregularity in the masonry. One stone was sticking out. He pressed it. The stone gave way. Behind it was a niche, a small one, about the size of a shoebox. Inside lay something wrapped in cloth. The cloth crumbled at his touch. Beneath it was a stone. No, not a stone. An egg. About the size of 2 fists. Dark grey with thin red veins. Warm, distinctly warm, as if a small fire were burning inside it. Ethan held it in his hands and felt a pulsation. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. He stood there for a minute. Then he wrapped the egg in his cloak. He went upstairs. He walked over to the hearth in the common room. He placed the egg next to the coals, not in the fire, next to it, where it was warm but not hot. Oswald saw it. He came over. He looked. He turned pale. The captain asked quietly if his lordship knew what it was. Ethan replied that he did.
Oswald said that no dragon eggs had been found in 300 years, not since the War of Ash, that they were considered a myth. What if someone found out? Ethan cut him off. He said that no one would find out. Not yet. The egg lay by the hearth, warm, pulsing, alive. Ethan looked at it and thought that this world was getting more complicated with each passing day. His body's memories told him that dragons had once been allies of humans, long ago, before the war that destroyed everything. And now a single egg lay by his hearth in a ruined tower on the edge of the dead land. And it pulsed. And it waited. 2 months passed quickly. Ethan counted the days with notches on a wooden beam at the tower's entrance. 61 notches.
61 days since he'd woken up in a shaking carriage with a split lip. The tower had changed. The wall on the north side was finished, 3 heights tall. Griffin had a wooden platform at the top for the sentries. The gate was new, made of oak with a bolt. Haggard had repaired the roof of the 2nd floor. The 3rd floor was still charred but had already been cleared out. Sheds had appeared in the courtyard. Griffin's workshop. Leah's corner with the stove they'd been building for the past 3 weeks. A pen for the 2 goats that Tom had traded to a passing merchant for 5 knives forged from common iron. The vegetable garden had yielded its first harvest. A small one. 2 buckets of turnips, a sack of barley, bundles of onions. Mary cried when she cooked the first stew from her own turnips. Not from turnips brought in from elsewhere, from her own. Grown on soil that had been barren for 300 years. People were changing too. The young soldiers, David and Alan, had grown stronger. Their wounds had healed. Serafina put them through their paces every morning, and by the end of the 2nd month, both were moving with confidence. Not experts, but not sitting ducks either. Finn had grown. Not physically. Inside. The boy who used to sit in a cage clutching his knees was now running around the yard with a stick and sparring with Gareth. He lost every time, but he got back up. Every single time. Kadir was back on his feet. His leg had healed. He limped. He'd always limp. But he walked. And he hunted. Yasmina taught him a new way to set snares, tailored to the local wildlife. Small game, steppe hares and birds similar to partridges. Not much.
But fresh meat in the cauldron every 3 days was a luxury by the Wasteland standards.
Oswald had changed the most. Ethan could see it. The old captain was still sullen and taciturn, but he had stopped praying for an easy death. At night, Ethan heard Oswald walking along the wall, checking the guard posts, adjusting the stones. One morning, Ethan stepped out into the courtyard and saw that Oswald had planted a flower, a small wildflower he'd found near the southern hills. He planted it in a pot of fired clay that Leah had made. He placed it on a ledge in the wall by the gate. He said nothing. Ethan asked nothing. The egg by the hearth was pulsing more strongly. Ethan checked it every day, morning and evening. The veins on the shell grew brighter. The red lines widened. The surface grew hotter. He could hold it in his hands, but only with difficulty. After a minute, his palms began to burn. Leah watched the egg from a safe distance. She recorded the changes, the temperature, the color, and the frequency of the pulsation. Ethan asked her to keep an observation log. She started a notebook made of pieces of leather sewn together and carefully recorded the data every evening. Serafina knew about the egg. Everyone in the tower knew. It's impossible to hide anything from 16 people living in the same building. Ethan didn't hide it. He gathered everyone together and told them straight out. A dragon's egg. A real one. Alive. If anyone outside these walls found out, it wouldn't be soldiers who'd come here. Armies would come. All the great houses. The king himself. Everyone would want to take the egg for themselves, and not a single one would leave them alive as witnesses. That's why silence isn't a request. It's a condition for survival. The people listened. In silence. No one objected. They understood. Each of them had ended up in the Wasteland because no one needed them. And in 2 months, each of them had gained what they'd never had before. A place to stay, food, work, and respect. They weren't about to lose any of it. On the 63rd day, Leah's furnace was ready. Griffin and Bran built it according to Ethan's blueprints. A shaft-style design. Double walls, air ducts, 1.5 times their height, coated with clay on the outside. The first firing took place without ore, just heating. A test. Ethan and Leah stood side by side, watching the heat rise from the top opening. The temperature. Was it high enough or not?
Leah tossed a copper coin into the furnace. The coin melted in a minute.
High enough. They exchanged glances. Leah smiled broadly and openly for the first time ever. The next day they conducted their first experiment with ore. Leah ground a piece of rock in a mortar. She sifted it. She poured it into a crucible. She placed it in the furnace. Ethan stood nearby and timed it. 20 minutes. 30. 40. Leah pulled the crucible out with tongs. Inside lay a lump. Small, silvery with a blue sheen, about the size of a thumbnail. It glowed, dimly, barely noticeable, but it glowed. Leah picked it up with tweezers. Her hands were shaking. She said it was pure spark substance, purified, concentrated. Any blacksmith in the capital would give up a year's wages for this lump the size of a fingernail. Ethan nodded. Then he asked if she could do it again. Leah replied that yes, she could. Maybe. And maybe even better. She needed time and practice, but she could do it. He placed his hand on her shoulder, briefly. He told her she was doing a great job. Leah didn't blush this time. She just nodded, like a professional who'd been told her work was done right. She was growing up, not for her age, but for the tasks at hand. On the 65th day, a merchant arrived, alone, on a mule, with 2 bales. Ethan met him at the gate. The merchant's name was Elmer, an old man, thin, with shrewd eyes. He said he traveled the outskirts selling odds and ends, salt, flour, needles, thread, horseshoes. He'd heard someone lived in the Wasteland and decided to check it out, maybe make a little money. Ethan invited him inside and fed him. Elmer ate greedily. Between mouthfuls, he looked around. He took note. The wall, the vegetable garden, the stove, the people. Ethan saw how his gaze worked. The merchant was assessing, evaluating, memorizing. After the meal, Ethan proposed a deal. He needed seeds, lots of seeds, different kinds. Wheat, cabbage, carrots, peas, everything the merchant could bring next time. He also needed iron, any kind, rods, sheets, scraps, and cloth, any kind, for clothing and bandages. Elmer asked how Ethan would pay. Ethan took out 5 knives that Griffin had forged from iron salvaged from the convoy's wagon. Simple knives, nothing special, but sturdy and sharp. Elmer took one. He turned it over in his hand. He ran his finger along the blade. He whistled. He said that knives like these fetch a good price at the market. The deal was done.
Elmer promised to return in 2 weeks with seeds and iron. Before leaving, he stopped at the gate. He turned to Ethan and said he'd overheard some talk on the way. That someone in the capital was interested in the Wasteland. Nothing specific, just questions. Who lives there? How many of them there are? What they do? Elmer didn't know who was asking, but he advised Ethan to be careful. Ethan thanked him. Elmer left. Ethan stood by the gate and thought. The capital was taking an interest. It could have been Cassius. It could have been someone from the Velcourt house. It could have been anyone. He returned to the tower. He went down to the basement. He sat down in front of the mirror. He stared at himself for a long time without touching it. Every touch cost him a piece of the past. He'd already lost the name of the street, the taste of his favorite soup, Foreman Pack's face. What's next? His mother's name, the smell of coffee, the feel of the steering wheel in his hands. Each time he lost something that made him Kim Jae-hyun. And each time he became a little more like Ethan Hartwell. He didn't know if that was good or bad. He just knew that the price was rising.
and that one day he wouldn't have anything left to pay with. He stood up. He didn't look in the mirror. Not today. Today he would decide for himself, without any hints. On the 78th day, the egg cracked. It happened at night, in the kitchen. Mary was the first to hear the sound, a faint click, as if someone had tapped a fingernail against glass. She was sleeping next to the hearth, guarding the supplies. She woke at the slightest rustle. She lifted her head and saw it. A crack ran down the shell from the top to the middle, thin, red, glowing. Mary didn't scream. She quietly got up and went to find Ethan. By the time Ethan came downstairs, the egg was already swaying. It lay in its little hollow by the hearth, rocking from side to side. More cracks appeared. 3, 5, 7. A red light shone through each one. The room grew warmer, noticeably warmer. Ethan sat down on the floor nearby. He didn't touch it. He just watched. One by one, the others gathered around. Oswald stood in the doorway. Serafina stood behind him. Leah squeezed her way forward and sat down next to Ethan. Gareth, Bran, Tom, Finn, Yasmina. Even Kadir hobbled over, leaning on his cane. Everyone stood in silence, watching as the egg swayed and cracked. The shell burst, not all at once, in pieces. First the top fell off, then the side. From beneath the shards, something wet and dark appeared. Small, about the size of a kitten. Grey, covered in slime.
With two folded wings pressed against its sides like wet rags.
The creature lay in the remains of the shell and didn't move. A second. 2. Then it raised its head. Small, triangular, with 2 eyes the color of molten gold. The eyes were large, disproportionately large for such a small head, and they were staring straight at Ethan. A dragon. He was looking at a dragon. The dragon was looking at him. The creature opened its mouth, small, with tiny teeth like fish needles, and it made a sound. Not a roar, not a scream, a squeak. A high-pitched, demanding squeak like that of a hungry newborn. Ethan reached out his hand. The dragon nudged his palm with its snout. A wet nose, hot skin, no scales yet, smooth skin like a lizard's. Then the dragon bit his finger, sharply and quickly. The teeth were sharp. They pierced the skin. A drop of blood. Ethan didn't pull his hand away. He watched as the dragon licked the drop of blood from his finger, tasted it, and looked up at him again with its golden eyes. And then the little creature crawled out of its shell, clumsily, on trembling legs. It shuffled across the stone floor toward Ethan, climbed onto his lap, curled up, and fell asleep. Ethan sat on the kitchen floor in the ruined tower at the edge of the Deadland, with a dragon on his lap. The creature weighed as much as a large cat. It breathed rapidly and shallowly. Its side rose and fell. Tiny wings quivered in its sleep. It was quiet. Everyone was silent. Then Ethan looked up and saw Oswald. The old captain was standing in the doorway, his helmet in his hands, his face wet. He was crying, silently, without wiping away his tears. 30 years of service. He'd grown up on legends of dragons, of the great creatures that flew alongside people 300 years ago, before the war, before the ashes, before the world turned grey and small. All his life they had been fairy tales, beautiful and dead. And now a tiny, wet dragon was sleeping on the lap of a boy with broken hands. Oswald silently turned away. He wiped his face with his sleeve and walked out. In the morning, Ethan ran into his first problem. The dragon wanted to eat. All the time. Every 2 hours he'd wake up and squeak. Mary tried giving him some porridge. The dragon sniffed it and turned away. They tried boiled meat. He turned away. Raw meat. He ate a piece. A small one. Then another. And another. On the first day alone, he ate as much raw meat as he weighed. Ethan estimated their consumption.
At that rate, their meat supplies would run out in a week. They needed to hunt. Hunt more.
He spoke with Kadir. Yasmina's brother was already walking quite steadily. He limped badly, but his hands worked. And for snares and traps, you need hands, not legs. Kadir nodded. He'd set more snares. He'd expand the hunting area to the west. He'd seen tracks there of something larger than hares. The dragon wouldn't leave Ethan's side. Literally. It followed him around the yard. It scrambled up his leg. It climbed onto his shoulder. It fell. It climbed up again. When Ethan climbed the wall, the dragon sat below and squeaked until someone came down and handed it up to him. Serafina once lifted the dragon by the scruff of its neck and handed it to Ethan. The dragon hissed at her. She looked at him expressionlessly. The dragon turned away first. The dragon wasn't afraid of Oswald and didn't hiss at him. But every time the captain walked by, the dragon would press itself against Ethan and follow Oswald with its golden eyes. Loud, big, noisy. The dragon had decided that Oswald was a big, noisy guy who needed to be kept in sight. Leah was the only one besides Ethan whom the dragon let near without protest. She would bring him pieces of meat, and he ate right out of her hands. Then he'd lick her fingers. Leah held back a squeal every time, but her eyes sparkled. She kept keeping a journal. She wrote everything down. Weight, height, tail length, wingspan, body temperature, amount eaten. Ethan named the dragon. Not right away. He thought about it for 3 days. Then he decided. Ignis. Fire in the ancient language of Asteria. Simple and clear. When he first said the name, the dragon raised its head. It looked at him and nudged his palm with its nose, as if it knew. On the 85th day, Ethan noticed something. After the dragon had bitten his finger while hatching, after it had licked his blood, a connection had formed between them, not a magical one, not flashy, not voices in his head, something more subtle. He could sense when Ignis was hungry, not because the dragon squeaked, before that, a minute before the squeak. He could sense when Ignis was afraid, when he was cold, when he was content. Faint echoes, shadows of emotions, as if someone were whispering in the next room and he heard not the words but the tone of voice. He hadn't told anyone about this. Not yet. He thought about the oracle, about the mirror in the basement, about how each use took away a memory.
And about how those memories didn't disappear. They went somewhere. He didn't know where yet, but he was beginning to guess. On the 88th day, Elmer returned, with a mule so heavily loaded that the animal could barely walk. Seeds, wheat, cabbage, carrots, peas, everything Ethan had asked for. Iron, rods and scraps. Not much, but enough to get started. Cloth, coarse, grey, but in one piece. Mary immediately began cutting it out. Elmer sat by the hearth and shared the news. He muttered, as usual, between sips of hot soup. In the capital, House Hartwell has fallen out of favour. The Earl is ill. His eldest son, Cassius, is running the affairs of the house with a heavy hand. Someone from one of the lesser houses has lodged a complaint with the king. As usual, the king is pretending not to hear. House Valcour has stepped up patrols along the southern border. The reason is unknown. Perhaps it's connected to the missing convoy. Or maybe not. Ethan listened. Every word, every detail.
Cassius is running things. That means the older brother is consolidating his power. Sooner or later, he'll remember his younger brother, the one he sent to die, and he'll want to make sure he's really dead. Ethan gave Elmer 10 knives. New ones, better than the first batch. Griffin had learned to temper the blades using the method Ethan had explained. Elmer looked at the knives and shook his head. He said he'd never seen such quality anywhere in the Outlands, only in the capital's workshops. Then he looked at Ethan with a sly gaze and asked if the young lord had anything else for sale. Ethan smiled for the first time in 2 months and replied that there would be soon. The 3rd month began with rain, the first rain in 2 months, short and warm. Ethan stood in the courtyard, letting the raindrops fall on his face. It wasn't supposed to rain in the Wasteland. According to all the stories, it hadn't rained here for years. But it was raining. Something was changing. Oswald noticed it too. He said that in 30 years he'd never once heard of rain falling in the Wasteland. Ethan said nothing. He knew it might be connected to what people were saying in the border towns. The Wasteland breathes. Magical storms. A rumbling beneath the ground. Missing caravans. Something was awakening deep within this land, and the rain was part of that awakening. The garden reacted instantly. Within 3 days of the rain, the seedlings had doubled in number. The barley had stretched upward.
The cabbage had begun to form leaves.
The peas had sprouted their first tendrils. Mary walked around the garden beds, murmuring prayers. Ethan walked around muttering calculations. If this rate of growth continued, by winter they would have enough grain to avoid being completely dependent on the merchant. On the 92nd day, an event occurred that shifted the balance of power. A rider arrived from the north, alone, on a fine horse, wearing a travelling cloak over fine clothes. Oswald spotted him from the watchtower. He sounded the alarm. Seraphina stood at the gate with her sword. Ethan went out to meet him. The rider stopped 30 paces from the wall. She pulled back her hood. A young woman, about 18 years old. Blonde hair tied in a bun. A beautiful, calm face. Too calm for someone who had come alone to a wild place. She gave her name, Anastasia Vanier, the youngest daughter of Lord Vanier. Ethan didn't move. Vanier. The house that controls the lands to the north of the Wasteland. One of the 12 great houses. One of those rumoured to have set their sights on this territory. Anastasia said she had come with an offer of friendship from her father. She brought gifts, fabrics, spices, a cask of wine, and a letter bearing the seal of House Vanier. Ethan invited her inside. Oswald objected. Quietly but insistently. The captain didn't trust the great houses. No, a single one. Ethan didn't trust them either, but he needed to know why she was here. Anastasia entered the tower and looked around. Ethan saw how she was looking. Professionally, appraisingly, counting the people. She noticed the weapons. She took note of the furnace and the workshop. She had been trained to observe. It was obvious. At dinner, she spoke. A lot. Elegantly. About the weather. About the roads. About how difficult it was to get to the Wasteland. About how her father was delighted that the young Lord Hartwell had managed to make this land habitable. Ethan listened. Silently. He ate. He nodded. He didn't interrupt. She was perfect. Every word carefully chosen, every gesture polished. The perfect noblewoman's daughter, trained in charm and manners. And that was exactly why he didn't believe her. That night, Ethan went down to the basement. He didn't want to use the mirror. The price went up every time. But Anastasia Vanier had come alone, to the middle of nowhere, to a man her house considers a nobody. This isn't friendship. It's reconnaissance.
or worse. He touched the mirror. Cold. 2 images.
The first. Anastasia stands over a sleeping Ethan. In her hand, a small vial. Poison. The second. The same Anastasia, but she's sitting by the hearth, next to Finn. She's showing him letters on a piece of leather. She's smiling. Not a noblewoman's smile. A genuine one. Ethan pulled his hand away. The payment had arrived. He'd lost the scent of coffee from the vending machine at the drilling station in Mongolia, cheap instant coffee from a plastic cup. He'd drunk it every morning for 7 years. Now he remembered what he'd drunk, but he didn't remember what it smelled like. He sat in the basement and thought. 2 images, 2 futures. Anastasia had come to kill him. That was clear from the first one. But the second image showed another possibility, the one in which she stays, for real. The mirror didn't say how to get from the first to the second. That was for him to figure out on his own. That morning he watched her. Anastasia went out into the courtyard early. She stood there watching Serafina train the people. Her face wore an expression Ethan recognized. Confusion, a slight, fleeting one, quickly concealed, but he caught it. She hadn't expected to see what she saw. People working together, talking to one another, eating from the same pot, and a lord digging the ground with his bare hands. It didn't fit with what she'd been told. He walked over to her. He asked if she'd slept well. Anastasia smiled. Perfectly. She said it was wonderful. Ethan nodded. Then he said he'd show her something that evening if she was interested. She agreed. That evening he took her to the garden. He showed her the garden beds. He explained what was growing and why, which seeds were planted next to each other to help each other, how compost turns dead soil into living soil. Anastasia listened, and Ethan saw how, little by little, the perfect mask on her face began to crack. She didn't understand why he was showing her this. She had come to play a role, to seduce him, to slip him poison, to go back home. But he was showing her the garden beds and talking about cabbage. On the second evening, he asked her to help Mary in the kitchen. Anastasia didn't refuse. She couldn't. The role required her to be helpful and sweet. She peeled turnips, her hands in the dirt, her nails broken. She had never peeled turnips in her life. Mary showed her how to hold the knife, patiently, as if she were a little girl. Anastasia said nothing. She just worked. On the third evening, Ethan saw the scene he'd been waiting for. Anastasia was sitting in the yard. Finn was beside her. The boy asked her if she knew how to read. Anastasia replied that she did. Finn said he wanted to learn. He hadn't been taught. He was a page. Pages were supposed to run after knights, not read books. Anastasia looked at him. Something flickered across her face, a small, fleeting expression. She said she would show him the letters. She picked up a stick and began to trace them in the dust. Finn leaned in and watched. Anastasia explained, patiently. And Ethan saw that very same smile from his second vision, the real one, not the aristocratic one, not a rehearsed one. The smile of a person who, for the first time in her life, was doing something not because she'd been ordered to. On the third night, Anastasia came to him. Ethan was sitting by the hearth. Ignis was sleeping on his lap. The little dragon was curled up in a ball and purring softly. Anastasia came in. She sat down across from him. She was silent for a minute. Then she said she had poison, a small vial, in the lining of her cloak. Her father had ordered her to poison Ethan, to slip it into his food or drink, and then return. Ethan looked at her. He didn't move. Ignis on his lap didn't move either. He was asleep. Anastasia continued.
She said she couldn't do it. She said she'd been watching these people and him for 3 days, and she couldn't. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain it. Maybe because he'd covered Oswald with his cloak when he'd fallen asleep over the map. Maybe because he'd shown her the vegetable beds with the same serious expression that other lords use when reviewing their troops. Maybe because Finn had asked her to teach him to read, and for the first time in her life, someone had asked her for something real. She took out a bottle. Small, glass, dark. She set it on the floor in front of Ethan, and said she was awaiting his verdict. Ethan was silent for a long time. Then he stood up, carefully, so as not to wake Ignis. He moved the dragon onto the blanket. He walked over to the hearth. He took the pot off the fire. He poured 2 mugs of the herbal tea that Yasmina brewed every evening. He set one in front of Anastasia. He sat back down, and he told her she could stay, if she wanted to. Just don't lie to him anymore. He was tired. Anastasia looked at him, mug in her hands. Steam rose between them. Then she began to cry. Quietly. Silently.
Tears streamed down her cheeks and she didn't wipe them away.
Ethan drank his tea and waited. He didn't comfort her. He didn't say that everything would be all right. He just sat beside her and waited for her to finish. Because sometimes that's all a person needs, for someone to just sit beside them. Winter came on the 100th day. Not right away. First, the wind grew colder. Then, in the morning, frost appeared on the rocks. Then came the first snow, light and dry. It didn't settle on the ground. It just flew horizontally across the plain like white dust. Ethan stood on the wall and watched. In a past life, he had endured 7 winters on the steppe. Mongolian, Kazakh, the real ones, when iron burns your fingers through gloves and diesel thickens like honey. He knew what cold was. But these people didn't. Not this kind. The tower wasn't ready. Not quite. The 2nd floor had been restored. The 3rd was covered by a roof, but the walls were full of gaps. The windows were patched with leather. There were doors, but drafts roamed the hallways like they owned the place. Ethan gathered everyone. 22 people now. 6 more had arrived over the past month. A wandering mason and his wife. 2 deserters from the eastern border. A young widow with a 3-year-old child. Everyone had heard from Elmer that there was a place in the Wasteland where they fed people and didn't beat them. Ethan took everyone in. He gave everyone a job on their very first day. The bricklayer got to work on the wall. His wife helped Mary. The deserters went to Serafina for training. The widow, named Helen, turned out to be a seamstress. Ethan put her to work sewing clothes and blankets from the fabric Elmer had brought. At the meeting, he spoke about winter, briefly, without embellishment. The cold would be severe. They didn't know just how severe because no one had spent the winter in the Wasteland for a long time. They needed to insulate the tower, seal the cracks, stockpile firewood, stockpile food. Every day until the first frost is a work day. After that, it'll be too late. He assigned the tasks. Bran and the stonemason are sealing the cracks in the walls with clay mixed with dry grass. Griffin is making shutters for the windows, double ones with an air gap. Ethan explained the principle. The air between 2 layers of wood retains heat better than a thick wall. Griffin didn't argue. He had long since stopped arguing with Ethan about technical matters.
Toma and Kadir are gathering firewood. There wasn't much firewood. There were almost no trees,
but the dry brush burned well. And Ethan remembered something from Mongolia, kizyak, dried manure. The 2 goats provided only a little, but Kadir had hunted a large steppe bull. The hide would be used for clothing, the meat for food,
And the manure, Ethan explained to Mary. The cook looked at him as if he'd suggested she fry rocks. But she did it. She dried it out. She tried it in the hearth. It burned, slowly, hot, almost smokeless. Mary sat in front of the hearth, shaking her head. Oswald approached Ethan that evening. The captain was more serious than usual. He said it wasn't just about the cold. There would be no merchant this winter. Elmer had said he'd come one last time before the snow fell and wouldn't return until spring. The roads would become impassable. 3 months, maybe 4. They'd be completely cut off. Ethan nodded. He knew. In Mongolia, they were cut off every winter. A work camp at -40. The nearest town 100 kilometers away. 4 months without supplies. He'd survived. But there they had canned meat and a generator. Here there was neither. He sat down and did the math. Well, 2 sacks of wheat, a sack of barley, turnips, cabbage, salted meat, peas, salt. If they cooked thin porridge twice a day and had meat every other day, if they used salt sparingly, if Kadir kept setting snares, if the goats hold out. It'll be enough. Just barely. For 3.5 months. The 4th month will be one of hunger. He called for Yasmina. He asked her which plants overwinter under the snow and are edible. Yasmina thought for a moment. Then she listed 3 types of roots that could be dug up from under the frozen ground. Bitter, unpalatable, but nutritious. She knew where they grew. Ethan nodded. It was a reserve, for a worst-case scenario. Elmer arrived for the last time on the 110th day. He brought the order. Iron, more than last time. Ethan paid with 10 knives and 3 arrowheads that Griffin had forged. Elmer twirled the arrowheads in his hands. He said he'd never seen work like that out here on the outskirts. The metal was smooth. The edges were precise, just like work from the capital. Then he looked at Ethan and asked where exactly the young lord had found such a master craftsman. Ethan replied that he had trained the craftsman himself. Elmer shook his head. Then he got down to business. News. He spoke quietly, for Ethan and Oswald's ears only. Cassius Hartwell had sent a letter to the king.
In the letter, he asked that his younger brother be recalled from the Wasteland. The reason? Ethan was failing to manage the territory, and the land remained barren. Cassius proposed transferring the territory to the control of House Hartwell, that is, under his own control. Ethan listened, silently. Cassius didn't know what was happening here. He didn't know about the wall, about the ore, about the dragon. He thought his younger brother was sitting in the ruins waiting to die, and he wanted to make that death official. Take the land, put an end to the matter. Second, Elmer had heard that the House of Vanya was concerned. Their daughter, Anastasia, hadn't returned. They'd been expecting her back in a week. A month had passed. Lord Vanya was keeping quiet for now, but he wouldn't stay silent for long. Ethan looked at Anastasia. She was standing in the courtyard, teaching Finn to write. The boy was diligently tracing letters with a stick on a clay tablet that Leah had made for him. Anastasia was guiding his hand, patiently. She was a different person. Not the one who had arrived with poison in her lining. But her father didn't know that, and he wouldn't have believed it. Ethan thanked Elmer. The merchant left, until spring. On the 115th day, a frost set in, a real one. The water in the buckets froze overnight. Ethan woke up from the cold. Ignis was sleeping on his chest. The little dragon had become his personal hot water bottle. The dragon's body temperature was higher than a human's, significantly higher. He radiated heat like a small stove. Ethan got up. He checked on everyone. Everyone was alive.
Everyone was freezing, but they were alive. He ordered all the sleeping quarters to be moved to the first floor, closer to the hearth. Warm air rises. The ground floor is the coldest. But if they block off the staircase and keep the fire going, if everyone sleeps in the same room, if they use body heat, 22 people in one room generate a lot of heat. He knew that. In the trailer in Mongolia, the 4 of them had slept in a space the size of a storage closet, and they'd survived. The first week of the cold snap was tough. People were freezing. They were coughing. Toma's coughing got worse. Yasmina gave him herbal teas. It didn't help. On the 3rd day of the cold snap, Ethan made a decision. He took Ignis and brought him into the common room. He placed the dragon in the center, next to the hearth. Ignis had grown.
He was already the size of a large cat. Scales covered his body, dark grey with red stripes. His wings had strengthened, his tail had lengthened, and he was hot. His body radiated heat within a radius of a few steps. People moved closer, at first cautiously, then more boldly. Ignis didn't mind. He lay by the hearth and purred, a low vibrating sound like a big cat. Toma sat closest of all. The dragon turned his head toward him. It looked at him with golden eyes and rested its tail on his lap. The old veteran froze. Then he slowly lowered his hand and stroked the scales. Ignis closed his eyes. Toma didn't cough until morning. That evening, Ethan sat by the wall and watched them all. The hearth was burning. Ignis lay in the center. Leo was fixing the burner. Rachel. No, Rachel hadn't come yet. Serafina was sitting by the door, keeping watch, even here, even now. She couldn't help but keep watch. It was in her nature. Oswald was telling a story. The young soldiers were listening. Anastasia was showing Finn how to spell his name. Yasmina was brewing herbs. Mary was tucking in Helen's sleeping child. Griffin was sharpening a chisel. Bran and Toma were playing dice. 22 people, in one room, in a ruined tower, in the middle of a barren land, in winter. And no one wanted to be anywhere else. Ethan raised his head. Ignis on the floor raised his head at the same moment. Golden eyes met his, and Ethan felt it. Not a thought, not a word, a sensation, warm and clear. Belonging. The dragon felt the same thing he did. Home. This was home. Winter lasted 4 months. Ethan counted every day, every portion of food, every bundle of fuel. On the 140th day, the grain supplies dropped to a critical level. He put everyone on 1 bowl of porridge a day, in the morning. At noon, only hot water with Yasmina's herbs. In the evening, a soup made from roots that Yasmina and Kadir dug out of the frozen ground. Bitter, sticky, but hot. People were losing weight. Oswald had grown gaunt. Bran had become quieter than usual. Toma coughed every night, but no one complained. Ethan ate the same food as everyone else, the same portion, not a gram more. They saw that. They remembered it. Serafina continued her training, every day, without exception. Inside the communal hall, sticks clattered against sticks. People moved in the cramped space. They sweated. They warmed themselves. The training wasn't just for combat. It was to keep the blood flowing.
To keep the muscles from weakening, to remind people that they weren't waiting for death. They were preparing to live. On the 150th day, Ethan walked over to the mirror. He'd been avoiding it all winter. 3 months without a single glance. Not because he didn't want to know, because he was afraid of the price. Each time he lost a piece of his past life.
And each time Kim Jae-hyun grew thinner, more transparent, like an old photograph in the sun. He remembered the facts. He remembered the knowledge. He remembered the skills. But the little things, human details, they were fading away. His mother's face, he no longer remembered it. He knew she had existed. He knew he had loved her, but her face was a blank spot. Foreman Park's voice, gone. Only the name remained, Park, and the feeling that he had been an important person. But why he was important and why, that was blurred. He sat down in front of the mirror, a black surface. He saw his reflection in it, Ethan Hartwell's face. Thin, with sharp cheekbones, with dark circles under his eyes. 19 years old. No, 20 already. His birthday had passed unnoticed. He touched the surface. Cold. And this time, something else. Not just images. A stream, fast and vivid. Spring. The snow is melting. A road from the north. 3 groups of people. The first, a trade caravan. 5 wagons. Elmer in the lead. But not alone. There are people with him. New ones. Many. Maybe 20. Maybe more. The second, horsemen in black cloaks, a symbol on their chests, a palm covered in ash. The ash palm. An order Ethan had heard about in the body's memories. A cult that believes the Wasteland must remain dead. That to awaken it is to invite the wrath of the ancients. A third group. A lone figure on the road. A woman, broad-shouldered, with a hammer on her back, red hair, walking on foot, resolutely, like someone who has nothing to lose. The stream of thoughts broke off. Ethan withdrew his hand. The price. He waited, tried to figure out what he'd lost. He searched his memory. Faces, names, places, tastes, smells. Then he found it. Music. He'd lost music. Not all of it. The concept remained. He knew music existed. He knew he'd listened to it. But not a single melody. Not a single song. Not a single rhythm. Silence where something had once played. He sat on a cold rock and breathed. It was the greatest price he'd paid so far. Not a fragment, an entire layer. The mirror was taking more, or he was giving more.
Or the difference between Ethan and Jae-hyun was fading faster than he'd thought. He went upstairs. It was warm in the great hall. Ignis was lying by the hearth. The dragon raised its head when Ethan entered. Golden eyes followed him. And Ethan sensed something strange through the bond. A fragment, not his own. A melody. Quiet. Unfamiliar and yet familiar at the same time. The dragon knew the song that Ethan had forgotten. He froze. He looked at Ignis. The dragon was looking at him. And for the first time, Ethan truly understood what was happening. The memories weren't disappearing. They were flowing over, into the dragon, through the mirror, through the bond. Kim Jae-hyun wasn't dying piece by piece. He was moving, from Ethan to Ignis. The mirror was a bridge, and the dragon on the floor with golden eyes knew the taste of kimchi jjigae, his mother's face from Seoul, and the smell of cheap coffee from a plastic cup. Ethan sat down next to Ignis. He placed his hand on the warm scales. The dragon moved closer. The rumbling grew louder. And in that rumbling, if you listened very carefully, there was a melody. That very one, the one Ethan no longer remembered but recognized. He closed his eyes. He sat like that for a minute. Then he opened them.
Winter continued, but spring was ahead. And with it would come people, all kinds of people. He had to be ready. Spring arrived on the 210th day. The snow melted within a week. The ground became soggy. Then it dried out and turned green. Not just by the well, everywhere. Grass was pushing through the grey soil of the wasteland, thin, timid, but green. Ethan stood on the wall and watched it. The earth, which had been dead for 300 years, was waking up. He didn't know if it had anything to do with the dragon, or the ore, with the fact that they had been digging, planting, and watering. Or perhaps the wasteland was waking up on its own schedule. But the fact was right before his eyes. Greenery, on dead earth. The first to arrive was a woman with a hammer, on the 215th day, red-headed, broad-shouldered, with the sunburned hands of a blacksmith. She stood at the gate and silently gazed at the wall. Ethan went out to meet her. She introduced herself. Rachel Ironwood, a blacksmith. Her workshop had been burned down by competitors. The guild had refused to protect her. Her husband had died 2 years ago. She'd heard from a merchant that the wasteland needed workers.
She'd walked for 14 days.
Ethan looked at her, then at the hammer behind her back. Heavy, with a long handle, with a mark on the butt. The letter R inside a circle. Her mark. He asked if she knew how to work with a special metal. Rachel looked at him. Then she said she'd worked with everything you could put on an anvil, and with things you couldn't, too. Ethan nodded. He led her to Leah's furnace. He showed her a piece of spark substance, a small ingot that Leah had smelted that winter. Rachel took it. She turned it over in her hands. She tested it with her fingernail. She held it up to the light. Then she looked at Ethan. Her eyes grew wide. She asked where it came from. Ethan replied that it was from the local hills. Rachel was silent for 10 seconds. Then she said she needed an anvil, a good one, a heavy one, and a forge, a real blacksmith's forge, not an alchemical furnace, and bellows, and tongs, and a quenching bath. Ethan said there was no forge, but there was stone, there was clay, there's iron, and there's him, with the blueprints. Rachel looked at him, then at the furnace, then back at him. Then she asked who had taught him metallurgy. Ethan didn't answer. He just smiled. A week later, they had a forge. Rough, open air, under a canopy, but functional. Rachel built the bellows according to Ethan's blueprints. Double-bladed. Clay walls with a fireproof coating that Leah had developed. They found the anvil in the old gatekeeper's quarters under a layer of dirt. Old, heavy, cracked on one edge, but it worked. Rachel forged her first blade from ordinary iron, just to test it out. Ethan stood nearby and watched. She worked like someone born with a hammer in her hands. Every strike was precise. Every heating cycle was perfectly timed. The metal sang beneath her hands. All the while she cursed like a sergeant major, loudly and colourfully. Bran stood 10 paces away, blushing. The blade came out smooth, sturdy, lighter light. Serafina took it in her hands. She tested the balance. She swung it 3 times through the air. Then she looked at Rachel and said the blade was good. Rachel nodded, without a smile. She knew the blade was good. Then Ethan gave her a bar of spark substance, a small one. He asked her to try it. Rachel worked with it for 3 days. She cursed more than usual. The substance didn't behave like ordinary metal. It didn't want to bend. It wouldn't take shape.
But when Rachel found the right temperature and the right rhythm for her strikes, when the metal finally yielded, the result silenced everyone. A spearhead. Small,
silvery with a blue sheen. It glowed, not brightly, softly. And when Seraphina mounted it on the shaft and struck the stone split. It didn't crack, it split right down the middle. Seraphina looked at the spearhead, at the stone, at Ethan. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Ethan asked Rachel to sign each piece, with her mark, the letter R inside a circle. Rachel froze. Then she asked why. Ethan replied that people should know who made it, that her work wasn't just a nameless commodity, it was her work, her hands, her craftsmanship. Rachel was silent. Then she turned toward the kiln. Ethan saw her run her hand across her face, quickly, as if brushing away dust. On the 220th day, the caravan arrived. Elmer, 5 wagons, and people with him. 23 people. Veterans, artisans, families. Everyone had heard of the Wasteland, a place where they take everyone in, where they feed you, where they don't beat you, where the Lord eats from the same pot as the soldiers. Among them was a woman, calm, with an ironic gaze, about 26 years old. She approached Ethan and introduced herself. Hannah So, a former governess at the royal court, exiled for refusing to give false testimony. She asked for a teaching position. Ethan asked what she could teach. Hannah listed them: reading, writing, arithmetic, history, languages, etiquette, diplomacy. Ethan listened. Then he said he needed a school. Not for the children of the nobility, for everyone. For the children of soldiers and blacksmiths and cooks, for Finn, for Helen's daughter, for everyone who wants to learn. Hannah looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that this was exactly why she had come here. That evening, Ethan counted 45 people. Out of the 12 he had started with, 45. A wall, a blacksmith shop, a laboratory, a vegetable garden, the school, the infirmary, the well. All of this had sprung from the mud and ashes in 7 months, on barren land, built by the hands of people no one wanted. He stood on the wall and watched the sunset. Ignis sat beside him. The dragon had grown to the size of a large dog. His wings had grown stronger. He'd already tried spreading them. He hadn't flown yet, but he'd tried. Ethan placed a hand on his head. Ignis snuggled up against his leg.
Down in the courtyard, lights were burning. Voices could be heard.
Laughter. Rachel was scolding Griffin over a crooked workbench. Seraphina was showing the newcomers the proper stance. Hannah was reading aloud to the children. Anastasia was taking notes as she read. Leah was arguing with Rachel about the melting point. Yasmina was silently arranging bandages in the infirmary. Oswald was walking along the wall, just like every evening. Home. He had built a home. On the 250th day, the ash hand arrived. Oswald had spotted them at dawn, 5 horsemen in black cloaks. They rode slowly, making no attempt to hide. On each man's chest was a silver palm covered in ash. Ethan went out to the gate. Seraphina stood on his right, Gareth on his left, Oswald behind him. The horseman stopped 20 paces away. The leader dismounted. Tall, thin, his face hidden by a hood. His voice was steady and cold. He introduced himself as Brother Marcus. He said that the Order of the Ashen Palm had been watching over the Wasteland for 300 years, that the Wasteland was a sacred wound inflicted upon the world for its salvation, that to awaken it would mean repeating the catastrophe of the War of Ash, that Ethan must leave, take the people with him, leave the land dead, as bequeathed. Ethan listened, silently. When Marcus finished, Ethan asked by whom it had been decreed. Marcus replied that it was by the ancestors, the great houses that had stopped evil 300 years ago. Ethan nodded. Then he said he wouldn't leave. Marcus was silent. Then he said that the order doesn't ask twice, that there would be consequences. He turned around, mounted his horse, rode away. The 5 riders vanished into the morning mist. Seraphina said there would be more of them. Ethan replied that he knew. A week later, a letter arrived. Not from the order, from Cassius Hartwell, delivered by a royal courier, a royal seal, an official tone. Cassius, on behalf of House Hartwell, demanded a report from Ethan on his activities in the Wasteland. How many people? What structures? What resources? What income? The deadline for a response was 1 month. Ethan read the letter. Between the lines, something else was clear. Cassius had found out. Not everything, but enough. That his younger brother was alive, that he had people with him, that the wasteland wasn't empty. And that infuriated him. 2 days later, a second letter arrived. From Lord Vanier. Polite. Icy.
The Lord inquired about the health of his daughter Anastasia, and he reminded Ethan that the guest's delay without notifying the family could be construed as hostage-taking. Ethan showed the letter to Anastasia. She read it. She turned pale. Then she raised her head and said she would write to her father herself, that she was here of her own free will, that she didn't want to go back. Ethan asked if she understood what that meant. Anastasia nodded. It meant that her father would come for her with an army, because his daughter's refusal to obey was an insult to the house, not because he loved her, but because she was his property, and property has no right to choose. Ethan sent 2 replies. To Cassius, he wrote a terse report. Minimal information, maximum formalities. The tower has been restored. The land is being cultivated. There are few people. No income. Supplies are needed. He asked for help he knew he wouldn't receive, but the request created a record, a formality. If Cassius attacked after receiving a request for help from his younger brother, it would look different in the king's eyes. To Lord Vanier, he wrote more briefly, that Anastasia was visiting of her own free will and was free to leave at any time. He enclosed Anastasia's letter. Oswald read both replies. He looked at Ethan. He said these were good moves. Then he added that good moves wouldn't stop 3,000 lances. Ethan replied that he knew, and that was why they needed to prepare. On the 270th day, Ethan went down to the mirror for the last time. He knew it would be the last time. The price would be too high. He had already lost almost everything personal. Faces, voices, tastes, smells, music. Very little remained. His name, Kim Jae-hyun. He still remembered that was his name. He remembered that he had been an engineer. He remembered his knowledge and skills. But the person behind them, the person with a mother and friends and a favorite soup and an apartment on a street with no name, that person had almost vanished. He touched the mirror. Cold. And this time, the mirror didn't show images. Words. Not in the language of Asteria. In Korean. The last language that connected him to the past. The words formed a text. You came because you were called. You were chosen because you have no blood of this world and owe no debt to its houses. You build, not destroy. You've already lost everything and know its value. I am the last of those who saw, the last dragon seer. My race was put to sleep by the 12 houses because they were afraid. Not war, not fire. They feared that humans and dragons would become equal, that blood would cease to determine fate. The wasteland is not dead, it sleeps.
and you will awaken it. Not with magic, with labor, with water, with seeds, with care, with what you do every day. The dragon on your lap is not a pet, it is my heir, and your memories are not a price, they are a gift. You are giving him what makes you human, and he becomes the one who was killed 300 years ago, a being who remembers, a being that understands, a being that won't let it happen again. Choose. Avenge my race, or build what you are called here to build. The mirror went dark, forever. The black surface cracked. It split into 3 pieces. The shards lay on the stone floor, dead, dark, ordinary stone. Ethan sat in the darkness of the basement. The payment had come, the final one. He had lost his name, not the name Ethan, but the name Jehion. He knew he had had another name, in another life. But which one? A void, a blank spot, like his mother's face which he no longer remembered. He sat there and breathed. Then he stood up. He went upstairs. He stepped out into the convoy. Ignis was waiting for him. The dragon stood in the middle of the courtyard and looked at him with golden eyes, and Ethan sensed it through their bond. A name, quiet, distant, uttered not by a voice but by memory. The dragon knew his name. The dragon remembered for both of them. Ethan approached. He placed his hand on Ignis's head. The dragon pressed close to him, and Ethan said quietly aloud, "Well then, so I've made it after all." Then he straightened up. He looked at the tower, at the wall, at the people, at the sky above the wasteland, and he went to prepare for war. They arrived on the 300th day. Ethan stood on the wall and counted. The banners of House Hartwell, a golden griffin on a blue field, about 1,000 infantry, 300 cavalry. Behind them, the banners of House Vanier, a silver vine on green, another 800. And between the 2 columns, black cloaks without banners. The Ash Hand. Ethan couldn't make out how many there were. They marched in the ranks of both houses, intermingled, like a shadow between 2 bodies. Cassius rode at the head of the Hartwell column, on a white horse, in polished armor, handsome, confident, with the face of a man who had come not to fight, but to settle the matter.
Ethan went down into the courtyard. 45 people stood before him, everyone who could wield a weapon.
30 fighters, the rest were children, the sick, and the elderly, against more than 2,000. He looked at each one. Oswald, the old captain, stood in new armor that Rachel had personally tailored for him. He wasn't smiling, but his back was straight. Seraphina, a sword at her belt, the very one Rachel had forged for her, to fit her arm, to fit her grip, to fit her height. The scar on her face stood out white against her tanned skin. She looked at Ethan and waited. Bran, Toma, Gareth, David, Alan, Kadir with his lame leg and a bow slung across his back. The 2 deserters who'd arrived in the winter and, under Seraphina's guidance, had become soldiers in just 4 months. The stonemason with his heavy hammer. Finn, 15 years old, with a sword that was a bit too big for him, but he stood firm. Rachel stood by the forge, a hammer in her hands. She wasn't a fighter, but she said that if anyone tried to climb over the wall next to her mountain, she would personally explain to him the difference between an anvil and a skull. Leah stood at the entrance to the lab, pale, terrified, but she held test tubes in her hands. She hadn't slept for 2 nights. She'd been preparing. Ethan hadn't asked what exactly. He'd seen the results during the tests. Smoke grenades, incendiary mixtures, blinding powder, things that didn't exist in this world. Yasmina stood in the doorway of the infirmary, silent. Next to her were bandages, water, herbs, instruments. She had prepared everything. Hannah had led the children and those who couldn't fight down to the basement, to the oracle's former room, the most secure place in the tower. Anastasia stood next to Hannah. She had wanted to stay upstairs. Ethan said no. She needed to be with the children. If the wall falls, if it all ends badly, someone has to lead them out through the southern passage in the hills. Anastasia knows the way. Anastasia knows how to survive on the road. She is the daughter of the great house. They won't touch her if she's alone with the children. Anastasia looked at him. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady. She said she would lead them out, and that she would return. Ethan nodded. He didn't give a speech. He didn't promise victory. He didn't lie. He said one thing. He said that each of them had come here because there was nowhere else to go.
And that beyond this wall lay the only place that had accepted them just as they were, and that he wasn't going to give it up. Silence. Then Oswald put on his helmet. Then Serafina drew her sword. Then Bran raised his axe. One after another. Silently. No shouting, no oaths. They simply took their places on the wall. Ethan climbed up to the tower, his place. Not in the ranks, high up, with a trumpet and a map. Ignis was nearby. The dragon stood at the edge of the roof, its wings half spread. It watched the approaching army with golden eyes. Cassius rode up to the wall within earshot. He raised his hand. The army stopped. He took off his helmet. A handsome face, dark hair, the eyes of an older brother who had always considered his younger brother a mistake. Cassius spoke, loudly, for everyone to hear. He said he had come to reclaim the lands that belonged to the House of Hartwell, that Ethan had no claim to this territory, that the people he had gathered were fugitives and criminals, that he was giving them 1 hour to surrender. 1 hour. Then an assault. Ethan didn't respond. Oswald spoke instead. The old captain stood on the wall. He took off his helmet. Grey hair, a scar across his forehead. 30 years of service. He spoke a single sentence. He said that this land was already occupied, and that they would not leave. Cassius smirked. He put on his helmet, turned his horse around, and rode back to his men. 1 hour. Ethan had 1 hour. He spent it on the tower, issuing orders. Serafina to the right flank. The wall is lower there. She took her position with 10 fighters, the best ones, the ones she'd trained from day one. Oswald in the center, at the main gate, with a reserve, 5 of them. They wouldn't move until Ethan gave the order. Kadir on the left flank, with a bow. He couldn't run, but he was the best shot. Rachel at the gate, with boiling resin. Her idea. Ethan approved. Leah on the wall, with her vials. Gareth behind the gate, in reserve with Oswald. Bran and Toma on the wall on either side of the gate, the old men with axes. They knew this was their last battle, and they were calm. The assault began at dawn the next day. Cassius didn't wait for the hour. He struck at night. Ladders up the walls, 100 infantry in the first wave. Kadir saw them first. The lame hunter from the southern steppes stood on the left flank and gazed into the darkness. He spotted movement before the others did. Step vision. His arrow flew into the night. A scream. The first. Then the second. The third. Kadir didn't shoot quickly, but every arrow found its mark. Serafina met the first ladder, silently, without a cry.
She simply stood at the top, and when the first soldier appeared over the edge of the wall, she struck. 1 blow, precise. The soldier fell, the second, the third. Her men stood nearby and did what she had taught them. Stance, block, strike. Simple movements, practiced 1,000 times over the past 6 months with sticks in the courtyard. Now the sticks were swords, and the movements worked. Leah threw the first smoke grenade as the second wave advanced toward the gates. Thick white smoke obscured the approaches. Cassius's soldiers coughed. They stumbled. They broke ranks. An incendiary mixture followed. Flickers of fire erupted on the ground in front of the wall, not lethal, but bright, frightening. The horses in the rear ranks snorted. They had held out on the first day. They lost 3 to wounds. Yasmina treated them in the infirmary. She worked in silence, quickly. Her hands were covered in blood. Her face was calm. She had promised that no one would be left here to die, and she didn't leave anyone behind. The second day was harder. Cassius sent the cavalry to the left flank. The wall was lower there. Kadir shot until he ran out of arrows. Then he took a spear and stood his ground with it, on his lame leg, without retreating. Serafina redeployed 5 men to the left flank. She weakened the right. Ethan saw this from the tower. He relayed the order. Rachel, the second gate, only on the red flag. Rachel was waiting. When Vanier's cavalry flanked the wall and struck the weakened right flank, Ethan raised the red flag. Rachel opened the second gate, the small one, the side, which they had cut through the wall specifically for this purpose. Gareth emerged from the gate, with 10 fighters, to engage the cavalry on the flank. Do not attack. Hold them off. Give Serafina time to return. Gareth was enormous, with a broken nose and a sword that Rachel had forged specifically for his hand. He stood in the doorway and didn't let anyone through, not a single one. 3 minutes, until Serafina returned to the right flank and struck back. The third day was the most terrifying. Cassius abandoned everyone. The Ash Hand stepped forward. There were about 100 of them, people in black cloaks. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They walked at a steady pace, and a grey light emanated from their palms. Blood magic. Ethan watched from the tower as the light struck the wall. The stones trembled.
Leah's spell cracked in one spot, then another. The wall held, but the cracks were spreading. Ethan went down. For the first time in 3 days, he left his post. He walked across the courtyard, past the wounded, past Yasmina, her hands red with blood, past Hannah, who was holding a crying child by the hand. He went out to the gate. Oswald was standing there. His helmet was dented. There was blood on his cheek, but he was standing. Ethan looked at him. Oswald looked at Ethan. The captain said quietly that the wall wouldn't withstand another blow. Ethan nodded. Then he looked up. Ignis was standing on the roof of the tower, his wings spread wide, full span. He had grown over these past months, about the size of a large dog. Not huge, not scary, not that colossus from the legends. A small dragon on the roof of a ruined tower. But Ethan sensed it through their bond. Readiness. Ignis was ready. He turned toward the dragon and said nothing. There was no need. The bond worked without words. Ignis leapt. His wings cut through the air. Once, twice, 3 times. He rose, clumsily, unevenly. His first flight, jerking and uneven. He rose above the tower, above the wall, above the field in front of it. He turned to face the rising sun, and his silhouette stood out against the backdrop of dawn. Small, imperfect, trembling in the wind, but real. A dragon. A living dragon in the sky above the wasteland, for the first time in 300 years. Below, the army froze. 2,000 men stood and looked up. Soldiers who had heard fairy tales their whole lives. Veterans who considered dragons a myth. Knights who had dreamed of seeing one, even just once.
Everyone was looking up. Ignis didn't breathe fire. He didn't attack. He was simply flying, against the sun, small and real. And that was enough. On the wall, Oswald took off his helmet. His grey hair fluttered in the wind. The old captain looked up, and his face bore an expression Ethan had seen only once before, when the dragon hatched. Oswald said quietly, "Finally." Then he put his helmet back on. He turned to the reserve unit. 5 of them, old and young. Everyone was looking at him. Oswald said, "Follow me." And he led them into a counterattack, through the gates, straight into the fray. Not for victory, but to strike, to show that these people would not give up. Seraphina struck from the right flank, simultaneously, without orders. She saw Oswald and understood. 20 people against 2,000.
But 20 people who knew what they were fighting for, and 20 people trained by the finest blade the House of Velcourt had ever produced.
The strike was short, fierce, and precise. The Ash-Hand's line wavered, not from the force of the blow, from the surprise. They had expected the wall to collapse and the people behind it to flee. The people did not flee. They came out to meet them. Cassius stood in the rear ranks. Ethan saw him from the tower. His older brother was looking at the dragon in the sky, at the people who had emerged from behind the wall, at Oswald, who was fighting just as he had 30 years ago, at Seraphina, who moved like water, flowing between blows, elusive and deadly. And Ethan saw Cassius's face change. Not fear, not anger, confusion. He couldn't understand how the 13 men he'd sent to their deaths had turned into this. The battle ended by noon. Not a victory, not a defeat. Cassius withdrew his troops to the safety of camp. There were casualties on both sides, but to Ethan every single man counted. 7 were wounded, 2 were seriously injured. Yasmina didn't leave the infirmary until nightfall. Ethan sent Finn with a white flag, a 15-year-old boy, with a sword that was too big for him. He stood before the army and didn't tremble. Seraphina had taught him not to tremble. The proposal was simple. Negotiations. Cassius agreed. They met halfway between the camp and the wall. Ethan, Cassius, unarmed, without an entourage. The brothers stood facing each other. Cassius spoke first. He said that Ethan didn't understand what he was doing, that the dragon wasn't a banner, it was a threat, that the great houses would unite against him, that the king would send an army, that everything he had built would be burned to the ground, that he wasn't destroying himself, but these people who had believed in him. Ethan listened. Then he replied. He said that Cassius wasn't afraid of the dragon, nor of him. Cassius was afraid of an idea. The idea that a veteran deserves boots that fit, that a blacksmith has the right to sign his work, that a girl can be an alchemist instead of a wife, that a boy page can learn to read, that a place where people are valued for what they do, not for the blood in their veins, can exist. That's what Cassius fears. Not an army of 30 men, but the very fact that this army exists at all. Cassius was silent. His face was stony. Then he said quietly that Ethan didn't understand, that he wasn't killing him.
"He was killing a dangerous precedent," Ethan replied. "He said that the precedent had already been set. The dragon was already flying. People had already seen it. And no matter what Cassius did to this tower and these people, those who saw the dragon in the sky will tell others, and those will tell the next, and in a year, in 10 years, in a generation.
Someone will come to this land and start all over again, because you can't kill an idea with a spear. Cassius stood there. The wind ruffled his cloak. Then he turned and walked away. In the morning, the army set out. Not all of it. The Vani were the first to leave. Lord Vani had received a letter from his daughter and had seen the dragon in the sky. He didn't want to fight the dragon. No one did. The ash hand vanished into the night, quietly, just as they had come. Cassius was the last to leave. Slowly. Looking back, he hadn't come to terms with it. Ethan knew. He would return. But not now. Right now, the price was too high. Ethan stood at the gate. Seraphina was beside him. Covered in blood, both enemy and her own. She stood upright, as always. But when the last banner disappeared over the horizon, she sank to one knee. Not because of a wound. From exhaustion. She simply had no strength left. Anastasia came out of the tower. Silently, she handed her some water. Seraphina took it. She drank. She looked at Anastasia, then at Ethan. And for the first time ever, she nodded to him. Not as a soldier to a commander, but as one human being to another. Ethan walked across the courtyard, past Leah, who was sitting on the ground, completely exhausted, covered in soot and chemicals. She raised her head as he passed and smiled, tired but happy. Past Rachel, who was already inspecting the gate, smashed, warped. She muttered that she'd fix it in 2 days, maybe 3. Past Yasmina, who had stepped out of the infirmary for a moment to breathe some fresh air. Her hands were covered in blood. Her face was calm. She looked at Ethan and nodded silently. Everyone was alive. The wounded would survive. Past Hannah, who was leading the children out of the basement. Helen's daughter was clinging to her skirt. Hannah looked up at Ethan. There was something in her eyes. Something warm and quiet. Something that can't be put into words. Past Oswald. The old captain was sitting on a rock by the wall. His helmet lay nearby. His sword was stuck in the ground. Blood on his hands, on his face, on his armor.
He was looking up at the sky where Ignis was still circling.
Slowly and erratically, tired, but still flying.
Oswald heard footsteps. He turned. He looked at Ethan and he smiled. For the first time in a long time. A genuine smile from an old soldier who had lived to see something he never expected. Ethan walked past him, entered the tower, climbed onto the roof. Ignis landed beside him, heavy. His wings folded. The dragon lay down and rested his head on Ethan's lap. Hot, heavy, alive. Ethan placed his hand on the dragon's head, scales beneath his palm, warm and smooth. He looked out at the wasteland, at the greenery pushing through the grey earth, at the wall they'd built with their own hands, at the courtyard where people were beginning to clean up the traces of battle, at the vegetable garden that had survived the winter, at Rachel's blacksmith shop, at Leah's laboratory, at Yasmina's infirmary, at Hannah's school, at everything that had grown from nothing over the past 10 months. Through their bond he could sense Ignis, and through Ignis he sensed something else. Something distant. Something deep, beneath the earth. The wasteland was breathing. Not with storms, not with a rumble. Calmly and steadily, like a sleeper beginning to wake. Slowly, gently. He didn't know what would happen next. Cassius would return. The king would send men. The other houses would take an interest. There would be new threats, new problems, new choices. But right now, at this very moment, the sun hung over the wasteland,
The dragon slept on his lap. The walls stood. People were alive. And down in the courtyard, Finn was carefully writing his name on a clay tablet, letter by letter, under Anastasia's watchful eye. She was smiling. Ethan closed his eyes. The wind was blowing from the south, warm, smelling of grass and earth, and something else, something new, something that didn't have a name yet. He opened his eyes. He looked at the dragon. The dragon was sleeping, and in its sleep, quietly hummed a melody that Ethan no longer remembered but recognized. The house still stands. It was all for a reason.